What's up guys, it's TrueCoder here. So today we're gonna learn how to make this complete portfolio website from scratch. We're gonna use HTML and CSS to build it and make it responsive. We're also gonna use JavaScript to add some animations and make the website interactive. And finally, by the end of this video, I will show you how you can deploy this website on Hostinger, which is the sponsor of today's video. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now this video is sponsored by Hostinger. Hostinger is one of the cheapest hosting providers out there. It has a great price to quality ratio, extremely fast servers, and most importantly, 99.9% uptime guarantee. One more thing I like about Hostinger is their 24/7 chat support. So if you have any issue, just contact them and they will solve your issue for you. Now, as I said at the intro, we're going to deploy our website. So we need first to get the hosting and the domain name. Let me scroll down a little bit here, and these are Hostinger web hosting plans. So as you can see, they are really cheap. I mean, with only $1 a month, you can host your website, and also you will get a free SSL and much more features. Now we also have the premium plan and the business plan. In our case, we will go with the premium plan because it offers a few more features like hosting 100 websites, getting a free email, and even better, getting a free domain. The business plan is also a great choice since you will get a free CDN and daily backups, but I think I'm just gonna go with this one. Now you will find in the description an exclusive tracker link. If you use it, you will get a bigger discount. And also, you will find a special coupon code that will give you up to 91% off on all yearly hosting plans. After we select the hosting plan, we need to choose here the hosting period. Let's go with 12 months. Then we need here to enter the email account. After that, we need to select the payment method. And finally, before we hit submit secure payment, we're gonna click here to enter the coupon code, which is TrueCoder. This way, we will get an even bigger discount. Now I will skip the next part where I'm gonna confirm my purchase, and I will see you in Hostinger's dashboard. And we're here. So yeah, we have now the hosting, and also we have a free domain as you can see here. Now we're gonna move on to the main part of this video, and that is building the portfolio website. And then in the end, we're gonna go back here to deploy the final product and make it live on the internet. If this is your first time here in this channel, please make sure to subscribe for more tutorials like this one. Also, I put so much time and effort into these videos, so hit that like button. This way you will encourage me to do more tutorials. With that being said, let's jump into the video. Okay, so before we get started, let's take a look at what we're going to build today. So first, we're gonna create this nice header section where we're gonna have these navigation links. Then we're gonna move to the services section where we're gonna have these 3 services cards. Next, we have the portfolio section. In this section, you're gonna learn how to build this gallery image with this filter animation as you can see here. Just after that, we're gonna build this about section, and I will show you here how you can create these 3 progress bars that fill up on scroll. Below that, we have these 4 counters as you can see here. So we're going to be using CSS Grid to align everything in this website, including these counters. As we scroll down, we have the blog section, like so. Then we have the testimonial section. So here we're gonna learn how to create this oil carousel where we can go through the client's reviews. Next, we have the contact section. So here we're gonna learn how to make this beautiful contact form. Then we have the hire me section, and finally we have the footer section, as you can see here. Now in this section, we're gonna have this back button, which basically gonna take us to the top of the website. We're going to use only one line of CSS to do this effect, so make sure you stick till the end of this tutorial. Same thing will happen if we click on one of the navbar links. So if we click on the portfolio link, it will take us down to the portfolio section. Same thing with the about link and the other links. Okay, so the website is completely responsive on any device. So it's responsive on 1280 pixel screens. As you can see at this screen, the whole website gets smaller. Then on the tablet, everything goes responsive. So first we got this hamburger menu. Then if I scroll down, you will see that everything goes responsive. Nice. Now I will shrink this more. So the website stays responsive no matter what the size of the device is. As you can see, everything is responsive. Okay, so that's what we're going to build today. So if you want to know how to make all of this, then make sure to watch this video all the way to the very end. So now without any further ado, let's move to the text editor. Okay, so here I am at my text editor. I'm using VS Code for this tutorial. So I already created a folder. Inside of it, we have the files that we need to get started. Let me open the folder. So we have an HTML file, a CSS file, we also have the JavaScript file, and finally we have the image folder where we're gonna find all the images that we will use in this website. In the other window, we have Google Chrome, so we have the live server open in this tab, which is by the way a VS Code extension, so you just have to go here and search for live server and install the extension from here. Then if you want to run it, you just have to do a right click and open with live server. Or you can just click on this button. You should have here go live instead of that, but in my case I don't have that because I'm already opening the live server. Also, if you go back to Chrome, I have in the other tab the demo version of the website that I showed you at the beginning of this video. Okay, now before we get started, I just want to say that I will leave down below in the description a GitHub link of the source code if you want to follow along with me. And with that, let's get started. So first, we need to link the CSS file. So inside the head tag, we're gonna type link :CSS, press tab, then we're gonna add before that CSS/ because actually we have the file inside the CSS folder. Next, we need to link the JavaScript file. So inside the body tag, we will create a script tag. Then we're gonna go inside the JS folder and pick the app.js file. Now it's very important to keep this line just before the closing body tag, otherwise this is not gonna work. So keep that in mind. After that, I'm going to search here for font awesome CDN since we want to use some icons in our website. So let's copy that and paste it here inside the head tag. And there we go. Now we can use those icons. Let me just close that and yeah. Okay, now inside the body tag, we will start by creating first a main tag. So basically this tag will contain all the main content of the website. Let's open that. Then here we're gonna create a header tag. Now inside the header, we're gonna have two main parts. The first part is going to be the navbar and the second part is going to be the showcase area. So for now, let's add the first part, which is the navbar. So we're gonna add here a nav tag. Then inside of that, we're gonna create a div with class of container, because if we go back to the website, we don't want the navbar to take 100% of the viewport width, but instead we want to make its width smaller, around 90 rem or something like that. So we're gonna use this class in every section of this website to make some space in the sites and keep everything from going all the way to the sites. Okay, let's keep going. So the navbar will have two parts. The left part where we're gonna have the logo and the right part where we're gonna have the navbar links. So let's first add the logo. So we're gonna have here a div with class of logo, and inside of that we're gonna add the logo image. After that we're gonna have the navbar links. So we will create first a div with class of links. Then we will create an unordered list tag. So here we're gonna have a bunch of list items. For now, let's just open up the first one. So we're gonna have inside of that an anchor tag, since this is gonna be a link. And finally, we're gonna add here home. Now let's add more links. So the second will be services, the third will be portfolio, like that. The fourth is going to be about, and finally we're gonna have here testimonials. Actually, let's add two more list items. So here we have the contact link, and finally we have the hire me link. And we will also give this a class of active, because if you still remember, the last link of the navbar is going to be different, as you can see here. So that's it. Now let's save that, and there we go. We have the logo right here, and down below we have the links. Okay, now we're done from the HTML, so let's move to our CSS file. Now the font that we're going to be using is called Poppins. So let's go to Google Fonts, and let's search here for Poppins. Now let's select the size that we will use, like so. Then let's copy this line of code, paste it here in CSS, and that's it. Now let's start off with some base styles. So we're gonna use here the universal selector to select each element we have in the website. Then inside of that, I want to change margin to 0 and padding to 0 as well, which means that all the elements we have now and the elements we will add later are going to have a margin of 0 and a padding of 0. Now I'm also going to add the box sizing of border box. So with this line of code, the width and height of an element are not going to be affected by the paddings and borders. So for example, if we have a box that has a width of 100 pixels, then we give it a padding height of 10 pixels, the new width is going to be 110 pixels. But if we set box size into border box, the width will not change in this case and it will remain 100 pixels even if we add that padding. Great. So all of this is a kind of small reset. Save that, and as you can see, there is no more padding or margin on the links. Let's go back to our code. So now we want to change the font family to Poppins. For that, I'm going to select here the body element. This way the font is going to be applied on all the elements. But we have some exceptions, which are the buttons, the inputs, and finally text area elements. Open that. Then in here, we just have to say font family Poppins sans serif. Hit save, and as you can see, the font has now changed. Let's keep going. So now we want to get rid of that ugly underline below the links. So I'm going to select here every anchor tag we have. Then I'm going to set text decoration to none. I also want to get rid of the black dot that we have beside the list items. So I'm going to say here UL and set list style to none. One more thing, I want the images to take 100% of their parent width. So all we have to do is say image, then set width to 100%, and that's it. So hit save, and now all the images are going to take 100% of their parent width. And also there is no more underline below the links or dots beside the list items. Nice. Now all of this is actually general size. So let's create a comment here and say general size. Then let's comment underneath that and create another one, but this time let's say and general size. So it's a good practice to use comments, because that way if you want to come back to a specific part later, you can find it a lot easier. Now let's start styling our header. So I'm going to create here a comment of header. Then down below I'm going to add another one, but this time we're going to have end header. Now in between these two comments, we're going to select the header section. Then in here, we will first make sure that the header takes 100% of the width. Then I'm going to give it a background color of F6, F7, FB. And finally, I'm going to set overflow to hidden just to make sure that the overflowing content will be hidden. Hit save, and the background has now changed to that color. Now to prevent copy and paste the same color every time we want to use it again in the website, I will place this color in a variable and use that variable whenever I want to use that color. So let's pretend we already placed this color in a variable that we called background color. So if you want to use that variable, all we have to do is type var, open parentheses, then we're going to say dash dash and type the variable name, which is background color. Great. Now we need to create this variable where we will place our color. So let's go back to the top of this file. Great. Now the variables in CSS should be declared within a CSS selector that defines its global scope. In our case, we will use the root selector, which means our variables can be applied on every element inside the HTML file. Let's open that, and here we can define our CSS variables. So first we need to specify the name of our variable. Like I said before, the CSS variables must start with 2 dashes. So let's put them here. Then let's type background color, which is the name of our variable, add a colon, and here we will place our color, which is again F6, F7, FB. Now let's say we're using this color throughout the entire site. And let's say that later on, we decided to change that color. So instead of going through all the CSS and change the color in every place we use this, we will just have to change it from here, and it will change everywhere we use this in the website. So that's why we should use CSS variables. Hit save, and nothing changes. The header is still having that background color. Great. Now this is not the only color we'll be using in this website. So let's add quickly a few variables here. First we have a dark color. So let's create a variable with name dark1, and here let's add the hex value of that color, which is 333. Next we're gonna have another dark color, but this one is less dark than the previous one. So let's create a variable with name dark2. Then here we're gonna say 7a, 7a, 7a. After that we're gonna have a variable with name main color, and it's going to be 784CFB, which is a purple color. Then we're gonna have the white color, so let's say dash dash light1, and the value is going to be FFF. And finally we're gonna have another light color, so let's name this variable light2. Then let's add F9FAFB. I think I'm gonna change the name of this variable to light3 because it's actually a light color, and let's make sure we change that here as well. Great. Now let's start the navbar, which is this whole thing right here. So first we're gonna select the nav element. Then in here we will make sure that the navbar is taking 100% of the screen width, and we also want to make sure that it stays on top of everything. So I'm gonna set position to relative. Then I'm gonna set the index to a high value such as 50. So here as you can see I added a position of relative, and that's because the z-index property will not work unless we set a position for the element. Now it's time to style the container element that will make the width of the navbar smaller and keep it in the middle. So underneath that, I'm gonna select the container. Notice that the container is a class, so that's why I started with a dot. Now by default, the width of the container is going to be 100%, which means it will always take the full width of the screen. So what we're gonna do now is set max width to 92 RAM, which means the container width will be now 92 RAM, but if the screen goes smaller than that, the container will shrink to fit in the screen. Now as you can see, I'm using RAM for the most part of this website because it's more adaptable for different screen sizes. So basically 1 RAM is equal to 16 pixels by default. Now I'm also gonna give this a background color of red just so we can see what's going on. Hit save, and as you can see, the container is having now a width of 92 RAM, but if I shrink the screen, the container will also shrink to fit in the screen. Nice. Now we want to push the container to the middle. So all we have to do is set margin to 0 for top and bottom, and auto for left and right. Hit save, and there we go. After that, we need to add some padding in left and right in order to have some space right here. So we will say padding 0 for top and bottom, and 4 RAM for left and right. Great. So that's it for the container. Let me remove this background color, and yeah. Now the container is going to be a global style since we will be reusing it over and over. For that, we need to move it to general styles part. So let's copy this and remove it from here. Then let's paste it here, and there we go. One more thing, I want to make sure that the container is always on top of everything. So I'm going to give it a position of relative, then a z-index of 5. Okay, next we want to move everything in one line. In other words, we want the logo in left and the nav links in right. So for that, I'm gonna go to their parent element, which is the container class. So let's say nav container. Now there will be a lot of container classes in this website. So here we want to select only the one that you have inside the nav element. Let's open that. Then here we're gonna set display to flex. So that will turn this container div into a flex container, and this will turn the logo div and the nav links into flex items, which means now we can align them however we want. Okay, so after we set display to flex, automatically the flex items are going to be aligned horizontally because these are the default styles of the flex layout. Great. Now let's make the logo a little bit smaller. So we will select here the logo class, which is the wrapper of the logo image. Then here we're gonna set width to 80 pixels. So this is going to make the image width 80 pixels as well, because all the images are going to take the width of their parent elements as we did here. Let's save that, and as you can see, the logo is getting smaller. Now we want to push the image vertically to the middle. So we will go to its parent, which is the logo class, and we're gonna give it a display flex. This way we can align the image however we want. Then we're gonna say align items to align the image vertically, and we're gonna set that to center, which means the image will be moved to the center as you can see here. Okay, so now we want to push the nav links to right. So we will go to the container, which is the parent. So we already set display to flex. Now we will use the justify content property to align the flex items horizontally. So to make the logo in the left side and the nav links in the right side, we will say here space between, which means it's gonna make a space in between the flex items. This way we're gonna have the logo in left and the links in right. Now if I save that, as you can see, the space is put in between the logo and the nav links. Now we want to make all the links in one line, so we will come here and select the UL element, and inside of that we will set display to flex. Now let's take a look. So that's gonna put the links one next to each other. Now let's go back again to the navbar container. So we want to make it a little bit larger, so we will give it a height of 6 RAM. Now if I save that, as you can see, the navbar is now larger, but the links are not centered vertically. So we will come here and set align items to center, and that should fix it. Now let's start to style the links. So here we will select each anchor tag inside the links class, and inside of that we will first set display to align block, because by default the display is set to align for all the anchor tags, which means we cannot set width and height later on. And also the top and bottom margins or paddings are not respected for align elements. Then I'm gonna set padding to 0.9 RAM for top and bottom and 1.2 RAM for left and right. So now we have some space in between the links. Next, I'm gonna give the links a dark color, so I'm gonna say var dark1 to use that variable. Then I'm gonna set the font size to 1.05 RAM to make the font a little bit bigger. Now we want to make all the links in uppercase, so here we will say text transform uppercase. I also want to make the links a little bit bolder, so here I'm gonna set font weight to 500, So by default, the value is 400, which means if I increase that value to 500, it will make the links a little bit bolder. Now let's save that. So as you can see, the links are now looking better. Now one more thing, I want to make sure that the line height of the links is equal to 1. I also want to set transition to 0.3 seconds because later on we will add hover effect to these links, so we want to make sure that the hover animation is going to be smooth. Now let's style the last link that has a class of active, which is this one right here. So it's going to have a purple background color. So here we will set background color to the main color variable. I also want to make the text in white color. So here I will set color to the light one variable. I'm also going to set border radius to a high value such as 2 rem to make the sides rounded. So let's save that. Okay, now we have to reset the padding to make it look better and also make the font a bit smaller. So here I will set font size to 1 rem. Then I will set padding to 0.8 rem in top and bottom and 2.1 rem in left and right. I also want to give it a margin left of 1 rem to make some spacing between this link and the others. Actually, let's change this to 0.9. Okay, so now if I save that, the last link is looking better. Now I want to add some hover effects to the links. So let's come here and select each link by saying links A, and we're gonna add color hover. So when a link is hovered, we want to turn its color to the main color. So here we will say color, then we will use the main color variable. Now if I save that, we have our hover effect on the links. But we want to change this hover effect for the last link. So we will come here and select the link that has the active class, which is the one that we are talking about. So we want to make sure that the color stays white, and then we're gonna change the background color to a darker one. So here we will use this color, which is 6B44E0. So now when we hover on that link, the background color is going darker. Okay, so now we're done from the navbar, so let's move on to the next step, which is the showcase area. Okay, so let's go back to the HTML. So we want to close the nav tag, then underneath it, we're gonna open a div tag with class header content. So this is going to be the showcase area wrapper. And inside of that, we're gonna create another div tag with class of container to make the showcase area smaller and keep it in the middle as we did with the navbar. And it's going to have a class of grade 2 as well. So this is going to be a global class, and we will use it every time we want to create 2 columns inside an element. Because if you come here, the showcase area is going to have 2 columns. The first one that is going to have the title, the text, and the button, and the second one which is going to have the image. We're going to use the grid layout to create those columns, so that's why I named this class grade 2. Let's keep going. So inside we're gonna create a div with class column1, which is going to take the first column, and also it's going to be the wrapper of the title, the text, and the button. And we're gonna have a div with class column2 as well, which is going to take the second column, and also it's going to be the wrapper of the image. We're also gonna add an image class to the second column because it's going to have an image. So we will use that class to align the image inside. Now let's go back to the first column. So first we're gonna have this big title. So here we're gonna create a h1 tag, and we will give it a class of header title, and inside we're gonna say John Darcy. After that we're gonna have a text. So here I'm gonna create a paragraph tag with class of text, then I'm just gonna paste this text inside. After that we're gonna have the button. So here I'm gonna create an anchor tag and not a button tag, because when the user clicks on that button we want it to go to another page. So all the buttons in the website are looking the same, so they are going to have the same styling. For that, we're gonna create a global class that we will use every time we want to create a new button, because we don't want to copy and paste the same styling over and over. So we're gonna name this class btn, press tab, and here we're gonna put a number sign, because for now this is not going anywhere. And here we will say download CV. Okay, so now for the second column, we're gonna have an image. So let's create an image tag, and here we're gonna place our image patch. And finally, I want to give it a class of image elements. Now let's save that and take a look at what we have. So in top we have the title, the text, and the link, and here we have the image. Now let's move to the styling. So first we want to make those 2 columns. So as I said, we're gonna use CSS grid layout for that. So first we want to select the parent that has a class of grade 2. So let's say header content dot container dot grade 2. So this is the parent that we just select. So first we will set display to grid. So that's gonna turn this grid 2 class into a grid container, and it's gonna turn this column 1 and column 2 elements into grid items. So the way that grid system works is that you define different columns and rows with different sizes, then you can align and organize your grid items within those columns and rows. Now if I save that, as you can see, nothing changes because we didn't define any columns yet. So to define columns, we use the grid template columns property. So here we will specify the width of our columns. So let's say we want a 200 pixels column and a 100 pixels column. So this is going to define two columns. The first one width is going to be 200 pixels and the second one width is going to be 100 pixels. Now if we want a third column, we simply have to add the column width here. For example, let's add 300 pixels. And now we have 3 columns. But I'm gonna remove that because we only need 2 columns. Now let's save that. So as you can see, we have now 2 columns. Now actually, we don't want our columns to be 200 pixels and 100 pixels, but instead, we want from each column to take 50% of the grid container width. For that, we can simply set the width to 50% for both columns like this, but when we use percentages, we're going to run into issues with margins and paddings, so we're going to use the fraction unit instead. So let's here change this to 1FR, and also change the second column width to 1FR. So 1FR or 1 fraction means 1 part of the available space. 2FR means 2 parts of the available space. And in our case, the available space is the whole grid container width. So since both columns want to have 1 part of the available space, that means each column will take 50% of the available space. Now if I save that, we have 2 even columns that both take 50% of the grid width. So that's actually what we want for the showcase area. Now if we come here, we can use a function called repeat to define multiple columns with the same width. So we'll say repeat, and here we will put how many columns we want. So let's say we want 2 columns. Then here we will specify the width of our columns. So let's add here 1FR. So basically, we say that we want 2 columns of 1FR. So this code is identical to the first code, but much more cleaner and readable. Now if I save that, we got the same result. Now we want to make sure that the content of each column is aligned in the center. So we will come here and set align items to center. So that's gonna align the content vertically in the center. Then we're gonna set justify content to center as well, and that's gonna center the content horizontally. Hit save. Now the content of each column is centered. Okay, so now we want to give this showcase area a minimal height from here to here, which means it cannot be smaller than that. So for that, we're going to say min height. Then here we will use the calc function because we're going to calculate this height. So we're gonna have 100 VH, which is the viewport height. Then we're gonna subtract from that 6 rem, which is the navbar height. This way, the remaining height will be from here to here. Okay, now let's add a padding bottom of 2.5 rem. I also want to set text align to left. Hit save. So that's it. Now let's come back here. So we're going to be using this grid styles in many places. Let me just open that. So we will be using the grid in the about section, in testimonials, and in contact section. So for that, I'm going to copy these styles and remove them from here. Then I will go to general styles part, and here I'm going to select every grid 2 class we have, and inside I'm going to paste the styles. So now every time I want to create 2 columns using the grid, I just have to add this class to that element. Now the showcase area is already having this grid 2 class, so we still get the same result here. Now if we take a look here at the showcase area, you will notice that the second column is bigger than the first one, so we have to redefine the columns for the showcase area. Actually, we're not going to redefine the columns from here because we only want to change that for the showcase and not for every grid element we have. So I will come here and I'm gonna say grid template columns to redefine the columns. So right now, both columns are having 1FR like this, which means the grid width is going to be divided into 2 equal parts, and each column will take 1 part. But if I change the first column width to 2.5 FR and the second column width to 3.5 FR, the grid width is going to be divided into 6 even parts, where the first column will take 2 parts and half, and the second column will take 3 parts and half. This way, the second column is going to be bigger. Let's save that. So now the second column is bigger. Now let's style this title here. So let's come here and select the header title class. We're going to set font size to 3.8 rem. So that's gonna make the title bigger. I also want to set line height to 0.8. And finally, I want to set the color to the dark one variable. Hit save. So that's actually what we want for the title. Now let's move to the text. So we want to select the text class, and here we will set font size to 1.25 rem to make it a little bit bigger. I also want to set the color to dark to variable. And finally, I'm going to give it a line height of 1.6 to make some space between the text lines. Hit save. Now the text is looking better. So we're going to be using these text styles over and over in this website. For that, I'm going to move it into general styles part. Now let's come here. So we want to make some space between the text and the other elements. So here I'm going to select that specific text inside header content class. Open that, and here I'm going to set margin to 2.15 rem for top and bottom and 0 for left and right. Hit save, and now we have some space there. Now we want to style the link, so we gave it a btn class. For that, I'm going to say .btn to select that link. Open that, and here I'm going to set display to online block because by default the links are online. So we want them to be online block instead, because as I said before, the margins and paddings in inline elements are not respected, but in inline block elements they are. Good, now let's set padding to 0.85 rem for top and bottom and 2 rem for left and right. Then we're going to set background color to the main color variable, like so. I also want to set color to the light one variable, which is the white color. Then we want to give it a border radius of 2 rem to make the sides rounded. Hit save. Now we want to change the font styles. So here I'm going to set font size to 1.05 rem, and that should increase the font size a little bit. Then I'm going to set text transform to uppercase to make all the letters in uppercase. I also want to set font weight to 500 to make the text a little bit bolder. Now let's save that. So as you can see, the button looks better now. Now let's add some hover effect to this button. So we will come here and set transition to 0.3 seconds to make the hover animation a little bit smooth. Then here again, we're going to say btn to select the btn class. Then we're going to add hover. So when we hover on the button, we want to change the background color. So inside of that, I'm going to say background color, and I'm going to set that to this color right here. So this is the same color that we use in the navigation bar. Now if I save that, we got our hover effect. Okay, now let's add some space between these two columns. So we can simply use the grid cap property for that. But for now, I'm just going to use margins instead. So let's come here and select the first column, like so. And inside of that, I'm going to set margin right to 1.5 rem. Then I will copy that and paste it here. And this time, we're going to select the second column, and I'm going to change that to margin left. So now the second column has a margin left of 1.5 rem. Hit save, and that will make 3 rem of space between the two columns. Now I'm going to move that here in general styles part, because later on, if I create again 2 columns using grid, I'm going to add this column 1 and column 2 class to those columns to make some space between them. Okay, now let's make this image a little bit smaller. So here I gave it the CMG element class. For that, I'm just going to say here .header content, .image, .emg element, and that's going to select our image. Now you're probably wondering why I add this header content class here. So I added here .header content to make sure it's going to select only the image inside the showcase area. Now let's open that and set max width to 750 pixels. Hit save, and there we go. Now let's push the image to the middle. So right now you cannot see any big difference if I do that or not, but it's better to make sure that the image is always aligned to the middle. So for that, I'm going to select the image class, which is the image parent. And inside of that, I'm going to set display to flex, because I'm going to use flexbox to align the image. Then underneath that, I'm going to set align items to center and justify content to center as well. Hit save. So that's going to align the image in the center. Now I'm going to move that to general styles part, because I'm going to use it again. Okay, let's come here. So now we want to add those shapes to our header section. For that, I'm going to create an overlay div that will fill the entire header section. Then I'm going to add the shapes and place them inside of that div. Okay, so let's come here inside the header tag. Let me just close that. So inside the header tag, I'm going to create a div tag with class overlay and overlay LG. So this is going to be the shapes container. Now I'm going to first add this letter's image right here. So I'm going to create an image tag, and here I'm going to specify the image path. Then I'm going to give it a class of letters. Let's save that. So here is our image. Now let's move to the CSS code. So I will come here and select the overlay class, which is the shapes container. Then inside, I'm going to set position to absolute. I'm also going to set background color to red, just so we can see what's going on. Now if I save that, you will notice that the overlay is behind the header section. And that's because position absolute completely removed the element from the document flow. And the reason why it's behind the header and not in front of it, it's because both navbar and showcase have a high z-index value, which makes them on front. Now let's make the overlay fill the entire header section. So we will come here and set width to 100% and height to 100%. I also want to set overflow to hidden. This way the overflowing content will be hidden. And finally, I'm going to set top to 0 and left to 0. Now since we set position to absolute, we have to go to the parent, which is the header tag, and set position to relative to make sure that the overlay is positioned relatively to the header section. Now if I save that, the overlay is covering the entire header section. Now let's actually start dealing with this letter shape. So before, I'm going to remove this background color because I don't need it anymore. And here I'm going to say .letters to select that shape. Let's open that. So we need first to set position to absolute so I can move it around wherever I want. Then I'm going to set width to 13.5% to make it a little bit smaller. After that, I'm going to set top to -5 pixels to push it 5 pixels backwards from the top, and left to 15 pixels to push it 15 pixels from the overlay left. And finally, I'm going to set opacity to 0.06 to make it transparent. Hit save. Okay, we're done from this letter image. Now let's add those geometric shapes. For that, I'm gonna come here and again inside the overlay div, I'm gonna add the geometric shapes. So first, I'm gonna add the square. So let's create an image tag, and here I'm gonna add the image path. Then I'm gonna give it a shape class. So this is going to be a common class that we're gonna add to every geometric shape we have here. Then I'm going to give it a second class that I will name square, which we're going to be using to style this square shape separately from the others. Okay, so these are all the geometric shapes that we have. Now if I save that, you will notice that the square image is taking the entire width. And that's because at the beginning of the video, we set width to 100% for all the images. So to fix that, I'm gonna come here and say .overlay .shape to select each individual shape we have inside the overlay div. And inside of that, I'm gonna set width to initial, which means now the width is set to its default value. And in our case, the default value is the size of the image itself. Hit save. So now we can see our shapes. Now let's come back here and set opacity to 0.13. So that's gonna make the shapes transparent. I'm also going to set position to absolute. This way I can move around and place the shapes wherever I want. Hit save. So now we want to fix the size of these shapes. So I will come here and underneath that, I'm gonna take the overlay div that has the overlay LG class. And I'm gonna select all the shapes inside of that div. So the reason why I add .overlay LG here and not just say .overlay .shape is because later on we're gonna have other overlay divs in other sections. So here I add .overlay LG to make sure it's going to select only the overlay div that we have in the header section. Now let's open that. So we want from each shape to have a height of 55 pixels. Hit save. So all of them are having now a height of 55 pixels. But this wave shape is too wide, so I have to re-specify its size. For that, I'm gonna copy that and paste it here. So I gave it here a class of wave. Actually, we have two wave shapes as you can see here. So I'm gonna come here and add .wave. This way it will select only the shapes that have this wave class. And here I'm gonna change that to initial. This way, they are not going to have anymore this 55 pixels height. Then I'm gonna set width to 88 pixels. So now these wave shapes, instead of having a height of 55 pixels, they will have a width of 88 pixels instead. Hit save. So now they're looking better. Okay, now let's actually start placing these shapes. We're gonna start with the square shape. So let's come here and say header.square to select the square shape inside the header section. And inside of that, I'm gonna set right to 68% and top to 71%. Now if I save that, that's gonna push the square here. Now I'm gonna do the same thing for the other shapes. Okay, so now we're done from positioning the shapes, but here I think that the X shape is a little bit bigger. So I will come here and I'm gonna copy that and paste it underneath. And now instead of selecting the wave shape, I'm gonna select this time the X shape. And here I'm gonna remove this width and set height to 38 pixels. So the height was 55 pixels before, but now it's 38 pixels. Let's save that. So now the X shape is smaller. Now we still have to add these 2 point shapes. So for this one, I'm gonna come here inside the overlay div and I'm gonna create another image tag, and here I'm going to add the image path. Then I'm going to give this a points class, so I'm going to add the same class to the other points image because they're going to have some common styles. So I will make sure to add these styles in this class later on in CSS. And finally I'm going to give it another class called points1. Hit save. So there is our image. Now let's make it smaller. So I will come here and say header.points1 to select that image, and inside of that I'm gonna set width to 420 pixels. Hit save. Okay, now I want to decrease the opacity, so I'm not going to change the opacity from here because that's gonna decrease the opacity only for this image. So I'm gonna come here and select the points class, which means all the styles we specify here are going to be applied on this point image and the second points image later on. So here I will set opacity to 0.3. and I'm also going to set position to absolute. Let's save that. So now the image is transparent. Okay, now we have to push the image here. This time I'm gonna come here and set bottom to -75 pixels and left to -150 pixels. And that's gonna push the image to the bottom left corner. So now we're done from this points image. So let's move to the second one, which is this one right here. So for this one, I'm not gonna add it inside the overlay div, but instead I'm gonna add it here inside the second column div because I want to position it relatively to this column. So I'm gonna create an image tag, and here I will add the image path. And finally I'm gonna give this a class of points and the second class of points too. Hit save. So now the image is already transparent and having a position of absolute, and that's because we gave it the points class. But here, as you can see, the image is taking 100% of the container element width and not of the second column width. And that's because we still didn't add position relative to that column. So to fix that, I'm gonna come here. Now the second column has two classes. It has the column2 class and the image class. So inside the image class, I'm gonna set position to relative. You can also add that here in the column2 class instead. Hit save, and now the image is taking 100% of the second column width. Okay, now all the sizing and positioning are going to be relative to that column. Let's come back here. So now we want to change the image width. For that, I'm gonna say header.points2 to select that image, and here I'm gonna set width to 70%. Hit save. So now the image is taking 70% of its parent width. Now I want to push this image to the bottom right corner. So here I will set top to 65% and left to 71%. Hit save. And that's gonna push the image here. Now one last thing, the points image is actually in front of the person image. So we have to move that person image to the front using zIndex. To do that, I'm gonna come here and create a new class called zIndex, and inside I'm gonna first set position to relative because the zIndex property will not work unless we set a position to that element. Then here I'm gonna set zIndex to some high value like 2, so I will use this class every time I want to push an element to the front. So in our case, I will add that class to the person image, like so. Now hit save, and that's gonna move the image to the front. And with that, we're done from the showcase area, so let's move to the next section, which is the services section. But before, I just want to move all these styles into general styles part because I'm going to be using them again. Alright, so for the services section, I'm gonna come here underneath the header tag and I'm gonna create a section tag, and we're going to give it a class of services and a second class of section, like so. And inside of that, I'm going to use the container class because again, we don't want the content to go all the way to the sides, so we will use this container class to give it that 92 RAM width. Now if we come back here, the services section is going to have two parts. The first part is going to be the section header that has the title and that text, and the second part is going to be the cards wrapper where we're gonna have these three cards. So we're gonna come here and inside the container class, I'm gonna create a div with class of section header. So this is going to be the first part. Then inside of that, I'm gonna first add the title. So let's say h3.title, and here I'm gonna say services. Now I'm gonna create a custom attribute that I will name data title, and here I will add that text that we have in top of the title. Let me just come here. So in that attribute, we're gonna add what I do. So let's come back here and say what I do. Great. Now I'm gonna add that text. So underneath that, I'm gonna create a paragraph tag and I'm going to give it a class of text. So I already specify some styles in this text class which are going to be applied on this paragraph tag. Now inside of that, I'm gonna say lorem10, hit enter, and that's gonna generate a random lorem text with 10 words. Hit save. So now let's add these cards. So I will come here and underneath the section header div, I'm gonna create another div with class of cards. So this is going to be the cards container. Now each card is going to have a wrapper that we will name card wrap. So let's create here a div with class of card wrap. Now since we want 3 cards, I'm going to add a multiplication sign, then 3, press tab, and that's gonna create 3 card wrap divs. Now inside the card wrap div, we're gonna have the actual card. So let's say .card to create a div with class of card, and inside of that we're gonna have another div with class of card content. So in this div we're gonna have this icon, this title, this text, and this button. So let's first add the icon image. For that I'm gonna say here image to create an image tag, and in the source attribute I'm gonna specify the image path, like so, and finally I'm going to give it a class of icon. After that we're gonna have the title, so let's create an h3 tag, and I'm going to give it a class of title sm. Then here I'm gonna say web design. Now after the title we're gonna have a small text, so let's say p.text, press tab. Then here we want to have a random lorem text of 12 words. Great. Finally we're gonna have a button, so underneath that I'm gonna create an anchor tag with class of btn. So as I said before, I'm going to add this btn class to every button we have, including this one right here. Now this button is going to be smaller, so we're gonna have a second class of small. Then here we're gonna say read more. Hit save. So that's what we have for now. Now let's add the other 2 cards. For that I'm gonna copy this whole card div and I'm gonna paste it in the second card wrap div. Then here I'm gonna change the icon image. I'm also going to change this title to web development, and finally I'm gonna generate a new lorem text here. Now let's add that here as well. So I'm gonna change here the icon image. Then here I'm gonna change that to app development, and finally I'm gonna generate a new lorem text here. Hit save. So that's all we have in the services section. Now let's move to the styling. So I'm gonna come here in the CSS file, then down here I'm gonna create a new comment that says services, and underneath we're gonna add another one that says and services. So this is where we're gonna add the services section styles. Now first we want to make the icon images smaller, so we're gonna say .icon to select each icon image we have. Then inside of that I'm gonna set width to 90 pixels. Hit save. So now all of them are having a 90 pixels width. Great. Now we want to specify some padding in top and bottom. For that, I'm gonna come up here in general styles part and I'm gonna select the section class. Let's open that. Then here I'm gonna set padding to 7 rem for top and bottom and 0 for left and right. Now I want all the sections to have this padding in top and bottom, so that's why I specify the padding in this section class, which I'm going to add to every section we have. Now if we come here, we already add that class to the services section, which means if I save that, our section is going to have that padding. Now let's start to style the section header. So I will come back here and I'm gonna say .section header to select the section header class. And inside of that, I'm gonna first set text align to center to make sure that the text is aligned in the middle. Then I'm gonna set margin bottom to 1.5 rem. Now if I save that, the text is aligned in the center and we also have some margin in the bottom. Now I'm gonna style the title. So here I'm gonna select the title class and inside of that I'm gonna set display to online block. Then I'm gonna set padding bottom to 1 rem. Let's save that. So now the title is having some padding in bottom. Now I'm gonna set line height to 1 and font size to 2.8 rem. Hit save. So now the title is bigger. Great. Now let's add this little text that we have on top. For that I'm gonna use the before pseudo element. So here I'm gonna say .title column before. Let's open that and let's say content like so and just add an empty pair of quotes. So now it's like we inserted an empty span or div element before the content of this title element. Now it's very important to add this content property every time we add the before or after pseudo elements. Otherwise it's not gonna work. Okay, so actually we don't want to set the content to empty pair of quotes like that. Instead we need to set that to what I do. So I already add that in an attribute that I call data title. So to access to that attribute, I'm gonna say asher, open parentheses, and then data title. Hit save, and now we have what I do just before our title. Great. Now we can style our before elements as a span or div elements. So first, I'm gonna set display to block, which means our before element will take the whole line, and so it's going to be on top just like that. Then I'm gonna set margin bottom to 0.4 rem to make some space in bottom. I'm also going to set color to the main color variable and font size to 1.15 rem. Hit save. Now let's make this lighter. So here I'm gonna set font weight to 500 and that's gonna make it a bit lighter. After that I'm gonna set text transform to uppercase to make all the letters in uppercase. And finally I'm gonna set letter spacing to 3 pixels to make some space between the letters. So that's it for this what I do text. Now let's add this line that we have on the bottom. For this one, I'm gonna use this time the after pseudo element. So it's the same thing as the before, but the only difference is that this one is going to insert after the content of the title element. So let's say here .title column after, and inside of that I'm gonna say content and just add an empty pair of quotes. Because as I said before, we should add this content property every time we create a before or after pseudo element. Now this is not gonna have any content, so I'm gonna leave it empty like that. Okay, now let's set position to absolute, so we can move the line around the title element. And inside the title class, I'm gonna set position to relative to make sure that the line is going to be placed relatively to the title element. Alright, now let's come back here and set width to 90 pixels and height to 5 pixels. I'm also going to set border radius to 3 pixels to make the sides rounded. And finally, I'm going to give that a background color of the main color variable. Now let's save that. And there we go. Now we have to move it to the bottom. So I'm going to come here and set bottom to 0 and left to 50%. Now if I save that, the line is actually 50% from the left, but it's not in the middle. So what we're going to do is actually push this line backwards by half of its width. So to do that, I'm going to say here transform, and I'm going to use the translate x method that allows us to move an element in the x-axis. So in my case, I want to move backwards by half of the element width. For that, I'm going to add a minus sign, so it moves backwards, then 50%, which means half of the width. Hit save, and now the line is perfectly centered. Okay, now let's add a little bit of margin underneath the line. So inside the title class, I'm going to set margin bottom to 0.6 rem. Alright, so that's it. Now I want this text to go down into a new line. So here I'm gonna select the text class inside the section header, and inside I'm gonna give it a max width of 600 pixels. Then I'm gonna set margin to 0 for top and bottom and auto for left and right to make sure it's centered. Hit save, and now the text will go down into a new line. Great. Now I'm gonna move all these styles into general styles part because I'm going to use them again. Okay, now let's start styling our cards. So I will come back here and select the card class like so, and I'm going to give each card a specific width of 390 pixels and a minimal height of 520 pixels, which means the card's height cannot be smaller than that. And finally, I'm going to give this a background color of light 3. Great, let's save that, and there we go. Now we have to line up these cards horizontally. For that, I'm going to select the cards class, which is the cards container, as you can see here, and I'm going to set display to flex. And as soon as I do that, you will see that the cards are now next to each other. Now we want to distribute these cards evenly in the line. For that, we're going to say justify content, and we're going to set that to space around, which means it will take this remaining space that we have in right and put it around the cards. So let's go back and save that. So as you can see, that remaining space is now around the cards. Alright, now if I open the inspector and shrink the screen, you will notice that at the point when the cards get attached, they will start to shrink too. So we don't want that. Instead, at that point, we want the last card to go into a new line. So to do that, I'm going to set flex wrap to wrap and make sure that the width is set to 100%. Let's save that. So now if there is no more available space for the last card, the flex container is going then to add a new line and put that card in that line. Great, so now the cards need some margin. So I'm gonna come here, and this time I'm gonna select the card wrap class because I want to apply the margin on the card wrapper and not on the card itself. So let's open that and say margin 1.7 rem for top and bottom and 0.8 rem for left and right. Let's save that, and as you can see, we have some margin now. Let's keep going. So now we want to align the card content in the middle. So to do that, I'm gonna come here, but before doing that, I just want to make sure that the width is set to 100%, because if the screen goes smaller than 390 pixels and the card doesn't fit anymore on it, we want to make sure then it will take the screen width. Great. Now let's set here display to flex so we can align the card content however we want, and let's set align items to center and justify content to center. Hit save. And now the content is aligned in the center. But we still need to set here text align to center. Let's see now, and there we go. Now let's go back here and set padding to 3 rem for top and bottom and 2 rem for left and right. I'm also going to set overflow to hidden to make sure anything that extends beyond the card will be hidden. Hit save, and now we have some padding. Now I will go back to the icon class, and I'm gonna say margin bottom 1.7 rem to make sure we have some space underneath the icon image. Alright, now let's select the title SM class, which is the class that we gave to each card title, as you can see here. So inside of that, we're going to set color to the dark one variable. We're also going to set font weight to 600 and font size to 1.6 rem. Let's save that, and there we go. Now I'm going to move that to general styles part because we're going to use that class again. Now since we're going to have more, we want now to style only the titles that we have inside the services section. So we're going to come here and say .card.title.sm, and inside of that we're going to set line height to 0.8. So now only the titles that we have in the services section will have this line height. Great. Now I want to make these texts smaller. So here I'm going to select each card text like so, and inside of that we want to change font size to 1.15 rem. Then we want to have a margin of 1.8 rem and 0. Hit save, and that's it. Now we want to make these buttons smaller, so that's why I added here the class of small. For that, I'm going to say here .btn.small, and I'm going to first change padding to 0.7 rem and 1.8 rem. Then we're going to change font size to 1 rem. Okay. Now let's add those little words that we have on top. So I'm gonna come to the HTML file, and for each card here, I'm gonna add a custom attribute that I will name DHAKA card. where we're gonna put those words that we want to add. So for the first card, we're gonna have UI/UX. Let's copy that and paste it here. And for the second card, we're gonna have code. And finally, for the third one, we're gonna have app. Now I'm gonna come here and say .card column before to add a before pseudo element inside the card div. So the content of this before pseudo element will be the value of the data card attribute that we just created in the HTML file. For that, I'm gonna say here content attribute data card, hit save, and there we go. Now let's give each one of them a position of absolute so we can move them around however we want, and to make sure they're going to be relative to the card div, I'm gonna go up here inside the card class and add a position relative. So now we can come here and say top 0 and right 0, save that, and now they're up here. Okay, now let's go back and add a font size of 6 rem. Let's also add a font weight of 800 and a line height of 1. Hit save, and there we go. Now we need to change that color, so here I'm gonna set color to the main color variable, like so. I also want to raise down the opacity, so I'm gonna say opacity 0.025, hit save, and now they are transparent. Great. Now I think I'm gonna change the top position to -15 pixels and the right position to -15 pixels as well, hit save, and now it's kinda moved them outside a little bit. Alright, now we're gonna add this line that shows up on hover, so we're gonna come here and say .card column after, and inside of that I'm gonna first set content to an empty pair of quotes. Then I'm gonna give that a width of 100% and a height of 8 pixels. I'm also going to add bottom 0 and left 0 to make sure it's going to be on bottom. And finally, I'm gonna give it a background color of the main color variable. Let's save that. But the line is not in bottom as we accepted, so I think I forgot something. Let me just see. So we should add here position absolute. Let's save that now. And there we go. Now since we want this to show up only on hover, I'm gonna add here a transition of 0.3 seconds to make the animation smooth, and I'm gonna change height to 0 pixels. So when we hover on the card div, I'm gonna select the after pseudo element, and I'm gonna change height to 8 pixels. Hit save. So now when I hover on the card, the line shows up smoothly like that. Okay, now when we hover on the card, we also want to move the card to top a little bit. So I'm gonna say here .card column hover, and inside of that I'm gonna say transform translate y, and I'm gonna add -15 pixels. Let me just add here transition of 0.3 seconds. So now if I save that, the card moves backwards by 15 pixels on hover. But there is a problem here, as you can see. So when we hover at the very bottom of the card goes up and the cursor is not anymore on the card, and so the animation stops. So to fix that, we have to make sure that we hover on the card wrapper div and not on the card div. For that, I'm gonna change that here to .card wrapper column hover .card, and let's change that here as well. Hit save, and there we go. So now I'm gonna add those 2 point shapes that we have here, and I will be back when I'm done. Okay, so that's it for the services section. Now let's move to the next section, which is the portfolio section, as you can see here. But before, let me just move the small class to general size part. Let's move also the button class that I forgot to move it in the first time. Great. Now let's come to the HTML file and let's start by creating a section tag underneath the services section tag. And let's give that a class of portfolio and the second class of section, so we have some padding in top and bottom. And inside of that, I'm gonna first add a div with class of background BG, which is going to represent this purple background that we have here. Then underneath that, we're gonna have the container class, like so. And inside of this container, we're gonna have two parts. The first part is going to be the section header, where we're gonna have the title, and the second part is going to be the section body, where we're gonna have the filter buttons and the gallery. So let's come to section header and add an h3 tag with class of title, and let's say here portfolio. Now for the data title attribute, I'm gonna say my works. So that's what we're gonna have on top of the title. Hit save. So there is our title. And as you can see, we already have some padding in top and bottom, and that's because we add the section class. Alright, now let's come to CSS file and let's first create a comment that says portfolio. Now let's copy and paste that here and let's change that to end portfolio. So now we can start by selecting the portfolio class, which represents the whole section, and I'm gonna first make sure that the width is set to 100%. Then I'm gonna give it a background color of light 2, as you can see here. Okay, now let's cite the background div, but before I'm gonna add here a position of relative, because we're gonna give the background div a position of absolute, so we have to make sure it's going to be relative to the portfolio section. I'm also going to give the section temporarily a min height of 1200 pixels, just so we can see better what's going on. So now let's select the background div, like that, and first we want to make sure that our div is behind the content of the section. So we will give it a position of absolute, because position absolute completely remove the element from the document flow. Then we want to make sure it's going to have a width of 100% and a height of 520 pixels. Now we want to make sure it's going to be on top of the section, so we're gonna say top 0 and left 0. And finally, let's give it a background color of the main color variable, which is the purple color. Let me just add pixels here. Hit save. And as you can see, we have now our background behind the title. But now we cannot see anymore the line and the text of the title, and that's because they're having the same color as the background. So let's come here and change their color to white. We're gonna first select the portfolio title and its before pseudo element, and I'm gonna change their color to the light one variable, which is the white color. Like so. Then I'm gonna select the line. So let's change that to after, and I'm gonna change its background color to the light one variable as well. Hit save, and there we go. Now I'm gonna go back to the HTML, and inside the section body div, I'm gonna first add the filter buttons. So we're gonna have a div with class of filter, and inside of it, we're gonna have our buttons. So let's say button to create a button tag, and let's give it a class of filter btn. Now we're gonna have 5 buttons, so I'm gonna add here a multiplication sign, then 5, press enter, and we have now 5 buttons with class filter btn. Now for the first button, we're gonna have all. Then for the second one, we're gonna have UI/UX. The third one is going to have web div. The fourth one is going to have mobile app. And finally, for the last one, we're gonna have logo design. Now if we come here, you will notice that the first button has a white background color. Then when we click on a new button, that button gets that white background. So we're gonna use a class that we will name active to add that white background color. And every time we click on a new button, we will add that class to that button. Now since this all button is going to have that class at the first time, I'm gonna go back here and add that active class to the all button. Now let's save that, and there is our buttons. Great. Now first thing we want to do is push these buttons to the middle. So here in CSS file, I'm gonna select the filter class, which is the buttons container, and I will first make sure that the width is set to 100%. Then I'm gonna set display to flex, align items to center, justify content to center, and finally I'm gonna set flex wrap to wrap, which means if there is no available space for the last button, it will go down to a new line. Save that, and that's it. Now let's style the buttons. So I'm gonna say .filter btn, and I'm gonna first remove the border by adding border none. Then I'm gonna say outline none to remove the button outline. I'm also going to change background color to transparent. After that, I will give each button a margin of 0.45 rem and 0.4 rem, and a padding of 0.85 rem and 1.8 rem. Hit save. So now we have some spacing between the buttons. Now I'm gonna set color to white, like so, and text transform to uppercase. Let's also set font weight to 500 and font size to 1.1 rem to make the button text a little bit bigger. And finally, let's set line height to 1. Hit save, and there we go. Now let's add the active class stylings, but before I'm gonna add here cursor pointer, so we get that pointer cursor when we hover on the buttons. I'm also going to add the border radius of 2 rem and transition of 0.3 seconds. And now I'm gonna select the filter button with class of active, and I'm gonna change background color to white and color to the main color variable. Let's save that. And now the first button has that white background color. Let me just add an O here. And there we go. Now I'm gonna add those geometric shapes that we have in the background div, and I will be back when I finish. Okay, so now after we add the shapes, we're gonna create this gallery image. Now we can simply do that in HTML and CSS, but since we want to add this filter animation, as you can see here, we're gonna have to use a JavaScript library called Isochop. So let's go into a new tab and open the Isochop website, as you can see here. Now if we want to work with this library, we need first to add the Isochop JavaScript file to our website. For that, I'm gonna hit this download button. Then here I'm gonna click right and save that file in our JS folder. Now if I come back to VS Code and open the JS folder, you will notice that we have now the Isochop file inside. Great, now let's link that file to our HTML file. So I'm gonna come underneath the main tag and create a script tag like so. And for the source, I'm gonna go to the JS folder and take the Isochop file. Alright, let's go back to the library website. Now as you can see here, the Isochop library works with jQuery, which means we have to add jQuery to our website as well. For that, I'm gonna search here for jQuery CDN. Let's go here, and all I have to do is copy the script tag, paste it here, and there we go. So now we can use jQuery in our website. Great. Now when we use the Isochop library, we need to have a container element and a group of similar child items that each one of them is going to represent an image in the gallery. For that, I'm going to go underneath the filter div and create a div with class of grid. So this is going to be the container element. Then I'm going to add the gallery images. So here I'm going to say .grid item. And since we're going to have 9 images, I will multiply this by 9. Press tab, and there we go. Now we still can't use the library, and that's because we didn't call the library in JavaScript. So if I come here, you will notice that we still have to initialize the library in our JavaScript file. In my case, I'm going to do that with jQuery. So I'm going to copy this code and paste it here in JavaScript file. So basically all we did here is when we add this $sign, we call the jQuery object. Then we select the grid class, which is the container element, and then we add .isotype to call the library. And as you can see inside the parentheses, we have an object as a parameter. And actually this is the options object. In other words, in this object, we're gonna modify all the gallery options including the filter option. So for example here, we set the item selector option to grid item, which means we specify the elements with class of grid item as item elements of the gallery. Then we set layout mode option to fit rows, which means our images are going to be arranged into rows. Great. Now I also want to change the filter animation speed. So here I'm going to set transition duration to 0.6 seconds. Save that, and let's go back to HTML code. So now we want to add the images. For that, I'm going to go inside the first grid item div, and I'm going to add another div with class of gallery image. And the reason of doing that is, let me just come here. So as you can see here, we're going to have kind of 3 columns. So the grid item div will represent the whole column. And then inside of it, we're going to have the gallery image div, which is going to be the image wrapper. So let's go back to HTML, and inside the gallery image div, I'm going to add the actual image. So let's say image, press tab, and for the source, I'm going to go inside the portfolio folder and pick the first image. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the other grid items. So let's copy that and paste it here. And let's change the image to port2.png. Same thing for the third grid item. So I'm going to change that to port3.png. For the fourth one, I'm going to change that to port4.png. Let's also paste that in the fifth grid item. And for the source, I'm going to change that to port 5. Same thing here. So let's change that to port 6. For the seventh one as well, I'm going to pick the 7th image. Let's do the same thing for this one. And finally, for the last grid item, I'm going to change the image to port9.png. Hit save. And there is our images. Great. Now let's come to CSS file. So first thing I'm going to do is select the grid class, which is the gallery image container. And inside of that, I want to make sure that width is set to 100%. Then I will set margin to 1.5 rem and 0, just so we make sure that we have some margin in top and bottom. Now I'm going to select the grid item class. So first thing we want to do is changing the width. So if we go back here to the library website, they are setting width using percentages. So since we want to have 3 images in each row, that means I'm going to give each grid item a width of 33.33%, because 100 divided by 3 equals 33.33. So let's set here width to 33.33%. I also want to set padding to 1 rem and 1.2 rem to make sure we have some spacing between the images. Hit save. So as you can see, we have now 3 images in each row. Now as I said before, we're going to have the gallery image div inside the grid item div. So we want to make sure it's going to be always in the middle. For that, I'm going to come here and set display to flex. Then I'm going to set justify content to center. Great. Now I'm going to select the gallery image class. And first, we want to set overflow to hidden to make sure any part of the image that extends beyond the div will be hidden. Then I'm going to set border radius to 16 pixels, like so. Now I want them to have a height of 330 pixels and a width of 100%, which means for now the gallery image is going to take the full width of the grid item div. Hit save, and there we go. Now we still need to play around with the actual image inside, so let's go back here, and I'm going to first set position to relative, just so we make sure that our sizings and placings will be applied to the image tag later are going to be relative to the gallery image div. Now let's select the image tag, like so, and first thing we want to do is set position to absolute. This way we can size the image and move it around its parent. After that, we're going to set height to 115% because we want the image to be bigger. We're also going to set width to initial. This way the image is not going to have any more than 100% width that all the images have. Now I want to make sure that the image is centered. For that, I'm going to set top to 50% and left to 50% as well. But this is not enough, because all we did here is push the image by 50% of its parent width from top and left. So we still need to push the image backwards by half of its width. For that, I'm going to say here transform, translate, and inside the parentheses, we're going to enter two values, one for the x-axis and the other one for the y-axis. So for the x-axis, I'm going to add minus 50%, which means move backwards by half of the image width. And for the y-axis, I want to do the same thing. So I'm going to add minus 50% again. Hit save, and as you can see, our images get bigger and also they are centered. Great, let's come here. So now we want to add this hover effect that we have on the images. For that, I'm going to go back here, and first I will add a cursor pointer so we get that pointer cursor when we hover on the images. Now I will move to the HTML file, and underneath the image tag of the first grid item, I'm going to create a div with class of AMG overlay. So this is going to be the whole div that appears when I hover on the image. And inside of that, I'm going to create a div with class of plus, and I'm going to leave it empty like that. So this is going to be the wrapper of the plus shape that we get on hover. And underneath that, I'm going to add another div with class of image description, and inside of it, we're going to have first an h3 tag with content of logo design, then an h5 tag with content of view demo. Now let's add that to the other divs. So for the second one, we're going to have app development instead. For the third one, we're going to change that to web. Let's also add that to the fourth gallery image. And let's change that to UI/UX design, like so. Same thing for the fifth one. And we're going to change that to web development. In the sixth one, we're going to have again web design. Now let's add this to the seventh gallery image. And we want to keep the h3 tag like that. For the eighth div, we're going to have app development. And finally, for the last one, I will keep the h3 tag as it is. Save that. But we cannot see anything right now, and that's because they are behind the images. So to fix that, I'm going to come here in CSS file and select the image overlay div, like so. And inside of that, we want first to make sure that the overlay is covering the whole image. So I'm going to set width to 100% and height to 100% as well. And let's not forget to set position to absolute, otherwise this is not going to work. After that, we want to make sure that top is set to 0 and left is set to 0 as well. And finally, we want to set z-index to 2. This way it's going to be on front of the image. Hit save, and there we go. Now we want to change the text color to white. We also want to give each overlay div that transparent purple background. So I'm going to say here RGBA, then 120, 76, and 251. And for the opacity value, I'm going to say 0.55. Hit save, and there we go. Now we want to push this text to the bottom. For that, I'm going to give the overlay div a display of flex. Then we're going to set flex direction to column, because we have another flex item which is the plus div. So here after we set display to flex, our two flex items are going to be displayed horizontally as a row. For that, I set here flex direction to column in order to change their direction to go vertically instead. Let's keep going. Now after we change the flex direction to column, the two properties align items and justify content will be reversed. So previously, we used justify content to align the flex items horizontally and align items to align them vertically. But now with flex direction column, the justify content property will align vertically and the align items property will align horizontally. For that, I'm going to set here align items to center to push the flex items horizontally to the middle. Then we're going to set justify content to flex end to push the flex items to the bottom. Hit save, and that's it. Now let me just set padding to 2 rem for top and bottom and 3.2 rem for left and right. Hit save, and there we go. Now I'm going to select the plus div, like so. And inside of that, I'm going to first set position to relative, because later on we're going to add the before and after pseudo elements. So we want to make sure that they're going to be relative to this plus div. After that, I'm going to give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels as well. Then a background color of red, just so we can see what's going on. Hit save, and as you can see, it's right above of our text. So what you want to do now is come here and set margin to auto for top and bottom, which means it's going to take all the available space on top of the plus div and split it equally between the top and the bottom margins. Then I'm gonna add 0 for left and right. Save that. So now after we modify the placement of our plus div, I'm gonna go ahead and add those two lines that we have here. So one of them is going to be a before pseudo element and the other one is going to be an after element. For that, I'm gonna go back here and first I'm gonna remove that because we don't need it anymore. Then I'm gonna come underneath that and say dot plus column before, select the before pseudo element, add a comma, then dot plus column after, which means it's going to select both before and after pseudo elements, and all the stylings that we're going to specify inside of that will be applied on them both. Great, now inside I'm gonna first say content and I'm gonna leave it empty like that. Then I want to set position to absolute. This way we can move them around the plus div. After that, I want each one of them to have a width of 4.5 rem and a height of 3 pixels. We also want to make sure that they are aligned in the center. For that, I'm gonna set top to 50% and left to 50% as well. I also want to set transform to translate and I'm gonna add minus 50%, minus 50%, which means it's going to push them backwards by 50% of their width and height. This way, they're going to be perfectly centered. I also want to set background color to the light one variable, like so. And finally, I will give each one of them a border radius of 3 pixels. Let's save that, and there we go. Now we only see one line, and that's because they're on top of each other. So now all we have to do is pick one of them. In my case, I will pick the before element. Then I want to rotate it to be vertical instead of horizontal. So to do that, I'm gonna copy this line and paste it here inside. And just after the translate method, I'm gonna add the rotate method. And inside the parentheses, I'm gonna add minus 90 degrees. Hit save, and now we get that plus shape. Great. Now I want to push the text to the left. For that, all I have to do is select the image description class, which is the text wrapper, and inside of that, I'm gonna set width to 100%. Hit save, and there we go. Now I want to style this heading that we have here. For that, I'm gonna go back here and take the overlay div. Then I will select the H3 tag inside of it. Let's open that. So first, we want to set font weight to 600. Then we want to have a text transform of uppercase. And finally, we want to have a font size of 1.5 rem to make it a little bit bigger. Like so. Now I will move to the little text that you have underneath. So I'm gonna say that image overlay H5, open that, and we want to have a font size of 1.15 rem, then a font weight of 300 to make it light. Save that, and that's it for the overlay div. Great, now we have to hide the overlay div and then show it when we hover on the image. For that, I'm gonna go back here, and first I'm gonna give it an opacity of 0 to make it completely transparent. Then a transition of 0.5 seconds to make the hover animation smooth. Hit save, and now we cannot see anymore the overlay div. But here, as you can see, we're not having any more that pointer cursor when we hover on the image. So to fix that, I'm gonna remove that from here, and instead I will place it inside this gallery image class, because actually we hover on the gallery image div and not on the image tag. Now I can go down here and set the gallery image column hover. So when we hover on the gallery image div, we want to select the overlay div that we have inside. Then we want to change its opacity from 0 to 1. Save that, and as you can see, we get that nice fade animation on hover. Now also when we hover on the gallery image div, the image inside scales up smoothly as you can see here. So to do that, I'm gonna go inside the image stylings and I'm gonna first set transform origin to center. So since we want to scale up our image, we have to make sure that the origin or the point around which our scaling is applied is the center of the image. Then we want to set transition to 0.5 seconds so we get a nice and smooth animation. Now I'm gonna go ahead and say that gallery image column hover, and let's select the image tag that we have inside. So if we want to scale the image, we need to use again the transform property. For that, I'm gonna say here transform, then I'm gonna add again translate minus 50%, minus 50%, then we're gonna add the scale method which we're going to use for scaling up our image. Now if I add here 1, that's not gonna do anything because 1 is the actual scaling of the image. So if we want to grow the image, we need to increase this value. In our case, we're gonna increase that to 1.1. Hit save, and there we go. Now let's move into the filter animation. So first of all, when we click on a button, we have to move that white background color to the button that we clicked. To do that, I'm gonna go to the JavaScript file, and up here we need first to select all the filter buttons that you have in the DOM. For that, I'm going to create a constant and I'm going to name it filter underscore buttons, and inside of it, we will store our buttons. Now, if you want to select a group of elements in JavaScript, we use the query selector all method. So let's say document.query selector all, and inside parentheses, we're going to pass through a CSS selector for the elements that you want to select. In our case, we want to select the filter buttons, so we're going to say here .filter underscore btn. Now, I just want to mention that there is also a query selector method, and basically the difference between this one and query selector all is that query selector selects only one element. So if you use it here, it's going to select only the first filter button. But instead, the query selector all method selects all the available elements. So in our case, it will select all the filter buttons that we have. Let me just add an L here. So now the query selector all method is going to grab all the filter buttons and put them into what's called a node list, which is similar to an array. So basically, if you want to do something with the buttons, we have to loop through that node list and do what we want to do. Now the best way to loop through an array or a node list is to use the for each method. So let's say filter buttons.forEach, and then for each button inside that node list, I'm gonna take that button and add an event listener of click, comma, then here we need to specify the function that we want to run when we click on that button. In our case, we're gonna add an arrow function with no parameters. Let me open those curly brackets. So when we click on a button, first thing we wanna do is make sure that no button has that white background color. In other words, we need first to remove the active class from all the filter buttons. For that, I'm gonna say filter buttons.forEach. So for each button inside the filter buttons list, I'm gonna take that button. Then I can remove a class by adding here class list.remove, like so. And the class we want to remove is the active class. Hit save. And now when I click on a button, as you can see, the white background is removed from the first filter button. Great. Now after we make sure that no button has the white background, we can now add that background to the button that we clicked. Now we can access the button we clicked by saying here btn, because that's the name that we gave to the button we clicked, as you can see here. Then we can add the class by saying class list.add, and inside the parentheses, we're going to specify the name of the class that we want to add. In our case, we want to add the active class, so we're going to say here active. Save that, and now when I click on a button, the white background is removed from the previous button and added to the button we clicked. Great. Now we want to filter the images. For that, I'm going to go back to the HTML code. So now each gallery image div here is going to have a second class that specifies its category. Now as you can see here, we have 4 categories, which are UI, web dev, mobile app, and logo design. So I'm going to go to the first image, and the category that I want it to belong to is the logo design category. For that, I'm going to add here a second class of logo. Then for the second image, I want it to have a second class of web dev. Now the third image will belong to 2 categories, which are the UI and the web dev categories. For that, I'm going to add here a second class of UI and a third class of web dev. Then for the fourth image, we're going to add a second class of UI. The fifth image is going to have another class of logo. After that, the sixth image is going to have a second class of app dev. Then we're going to add to the seventh image a second class of logo. For the eighth image, we're going to have 2 classes, which are app dev and UI. And finally, for the last image, we're going to add a class of UI and the second class of web dev. Now let's go back to our filter buttons. So now for each button here, I'm going to add a custom attribute that I will name as a filter. And inside of that attribute, we're going to specify a CSS selector that matches the images we want to select. So for example here, if I click on the UI/UX button, I want it to filter all the images that have this UI class. So I'm going to add here .UI. Same thing here, so when we click on the web dev button, we want to filter the images that have the web dev class. Then here we want to filter the images that have the app dev class. And finally for this one, we want to filter the images that have the logo class. Now when we click on the all button, we want to show all the images. For that, I'm going to add here the universal selector, which means it's going to select all the gallery images. Great. Now I'm going to go back to the JavaScript code. So first, every time we click on a button, we need to get the value of its data filter attribute. This way, we're going to know which images we want to filter. So I'm going to come underneath that and create a new variable with name filter value. And inside of that variable, we want to have the data filter value of the button that we clicked. So here, I'm going to say btn to select the button that we clicked. Then we can access to the value of the data filter attribute by adding here dataset.filter. Great. Now I'm going to console.log this filter value variable just to make sure that everything works fine. So here, if I click on this UI/UX button, the inspector shows .UI, which is the value of the data filter attribute. Same thing here, if I click on the web dev button, we get .webdiv in the inspector. Also, if I click on the R button, the inspector shows the universal selector. So as you can see, everything is working fine. So now, after we know the value of the data filter attribute, we can filter the images that match that value. So we just need to call again the library isotope, like so. And inside the options object, I'm gonna add a new option, which is filter option, and I'm gonna set it to the filter value variable. So now every time we click on a filter button, the isotope library is going to filter the images that matches the value of this filter value variable. Save that. And let me just close the inspector. So now if I click on the WebDiv button, the library is going then to filter those images. I think we should now remove the space that we have underneath. So I'm gonna go back to the portfolio section stylings, and I'm gonna remove this min height. Save that. So now as you can see, we're done from the filter animation. But before moving on to the About section, I'm gonna add this portfolio button that we have here. For that, I'm gonna go to the HTML code, and underneath this grid div, I'm gonna add another div with class of portfolio. So this is going to be the container of the button. And inside of that, I want to add my button, so I'm gonna say here a.btn, press tab, and for the href attribute, I'm gonna add a number sign since this is not going anywhere. And here I'm gonna say portfolio. Hit save, and there is our button. Now we need to push it to the middle. For that, I'm gonna go to the CSS code, and here I'm gonna select the portfolio div, which is the button container. Then I'm going to give it a display of flex. And finally, we can push the button to the middle by saying here justify content center. Save that, and there we go. So now our portfolio section is complete, so let's move on and add the About section. But before, I'm gonna move all these stylings to the general styles part because we're going to use them again. Now we can come to our index.html file, and underneath the portfolio section tag, I'm gonna add a new section tag with class of About, and I also want to give it a second class of section. This way it's going to have some padding in top and the bottom. Now inside of that, I'm gonna add the container div. This way we get that space in the sides. Let's open that, and here we're gonna have two main divs, which are the section header div and the section body div. So inside the section header div, we're gonna have the section title. So let's create here an h3 tag with class of title. And for the content, I'm gonna say About me. And finally, above the title, we want to have Who am I? Save that, and there is our title. Great. Now I'm gonna go to our CSS code, and underneath the end portfolio comment, I'm gonna add a new comment that says About, and just underneath it, we're gonna have another one that says End About. So now this is going to be the About section area. So first thing I want to do here is select the About section. Then inside of that, I want to give it an overflow of hidden to make sure that everything goes beyond the section will be clipped. Now I'm gonna go back to the HTML code. So for the section body div, I'm gonna add a second class of grade 2 because we want to have two columns inside. Now let's open that and add our columns. So we're gonna first have a div with class of column 1, then a second div with class of column 2. And we're gonna also add a second class of image because we're gonna have an image inside of that. So we add that class to make sure that the image is going to be aligned in the center. Now in this column 1 div, we're gonna first have the small title. So let's come back here and add an h3 tag with class of title as m. Then here we're gonna say hello I am. After that, we're gonna have a small text. So we're gonna add here a paragraph tag with class of text. And inside of it, I'm gonna paste this text. Great. Just after that, we're gonna have the skills div. So I'm gonna go back here and add a div with class of skills. So this is going to be the whole skills div. Then here we're gonna first have the HTML part. So I'm gonna create a div with class of skill. And inside of it, we're gonna create an h3 tag with class of skill title. Press tab. Then here we're gonna say HTML. After that, we're gonna create a div with class of skill bar. Then inside of it, we're gonna create another div with class of skill progress. So the skill bar div is going to be this whole progress bar. Then the skill progress div is going to be that purple part inside the progress bar. Let's go back here. So now in addition to the HTML part, we're gonna have also the CSS and JavaScript part. So I'm gonna copy that and paste it underneath, like so. Now for the first one, I'm gonna add a second class of HTML since it's the HTML part. Then for the second div, I'm gonna add the second class of CSS because it's going to be the CSS part, and I'm also going to change that to CSS. And finally, for the last one, I'm gonna add the second class of JS, then I'm gonna change that to JavaScript. Now underneath skills part, we're gonna have a button. So here I'm gonna create an anchor tag with class of btn. Let's add a number sign here. Then here we're gonna say read more. Great, so that's all we have in the first column. Now inside the second column, we're gonna have this image right here. So I'm gonna add inside of that an image tag, and for the source attribute, I'm gonna go inside the image folder and pick the about.png image. Save that, and there we go. So as you can see, we already get those two columns, and that's because we added the grid2 class to the section body div. Now I'm gonna go back to the CSS file, and just underneath that, I'm gonna select the image inside the about section, and I want to give it a max width of 600 pixels. Hit save, and now the image is smaller. Just after that, I'm gonna select the text class, and I want it to have a margin top of 1 rem. Save that, and now we have some space on top of the text. Now I'm gonna select the skills div. Then inside of that, I want to set margin to 1.5 rem for top, 0 for left, 2.5 rem for bottom, and 0 again for right. Hit save, and as you can see, we have some margin on top and the bottom of the skills div. Now I'm gonna say here .skill, select each skill div here. Then I want to set margin to 1 rem for top and bottom, and 0 for left and right. Hit save, and there we go. After that, I'm gonna select the skill title class. Let's open that. Then here, we want first to change the color to 555, which is a dark gray color. We also want to change the font weight to 600, and let's also give it a margin bottom of 0.3 rem. Save that, and that's it for the skill title elements. Now I'm gonna add those progress bars. So I'm gonna go back to our CSS, and here I'm gonna select the skill bar div, open that. Then I'm gonna first give it a height of 10 pixels, then a background color of red, so we can see clearly our div. Hit save, and there is our div. And as you can see, it's taken the full width, so I'm gonna go back here and change its width to 70%, which means it should be now smaller. Now I'm gonna remove this background color, and I also want to change the height to 8 pixels. I'm also going to give it a border radius of 4 pixels, and finally I'm going to give it again a background color, but this time it's going to be ECE6FA, which is a light purple color. Save that, and there we go. Now let's move on and add the colored part inside of that. But before, I'm gonna first add here a position of relative and an overflow of hidden. Now I'm gonna come underneath that and select the skill progress div. Then inside of that, I'm gonna first set position to absolute so we can align this div inside its parent. After that, I'm gonna set height to 100% and width to 70%. Then we want to make sure that top is set to 0 and left to 0 as well. And finally, I'm gonna give it a background color of the main color variable, which is the purple color. Save that, and there we go. Now we're gonna add this transparent about that you have here. So I'm gonna go back to our CSS, and here I'm gonna first select the column 1 div inside the about section, and I'm gonna give it a position of relative. Now I'm gonna select the before pseudo element of the column 1 div, open that, and first thing we wanna do is give this a content of about. Hit save, and as you can see, we have now that about word on top. Let's keep going. So now we're gonna set position to absolute so we can align this about word however we want. Save that, and as you can see, it's now in front of this hello title. And that's because as soon as we set position to absolute, the about word is removed from the document flow, which means it's gonna come in front of the column content as we can see here. Great. Now I'm gonna change font size to 8 rem to make it bigger. Then I want to make it border, so I'm gonna give it a font weight of 800. And finally, let's change its color to the main color variable. Save that, and there we go. Now I want to make it transparent, so here I'm gonna decrease the opacity to 0.04, hit save, and now it's transparent. Great, now I want to move that over here, so I'm gonna set top to 20 pixels to move the element 20 pixels forwards from its current position. The thing that seems illogical for now, since we want to move this element backwards and not forwards. But I'm gonna fix that very soon. Let's also set left to 0, and now I'm gonna change the line height to 0. So here when I first set top to 20 pixels, I move the about word 20 pixels forwards from its very top edge. But then when I change line height to 0, I make the element height equal to 0, which means the top edge becomes at the middle, and so the element is pushed 20 pixels from its middle. Save that, and as you can see, it's now right here. Now let's add this point shape that we have behind the person image. For that, I'm gonna go back to the HTML, and inside the second column div, I'm gonna add another image tag, press tab, and for the source attribute, I'm gonna go inside the image folder, then inside the shapes folder, then I'm gonna pick the points4.png image. Now I also want to give this a class of points, which is a common class that we give to each points shape we have, and I also want to give the person image a class of zIndex to make sure it's going to be on front of the points shape. Save that, and as you can see, we have now the points shape behind the person image. Great, now I'm gonna come to our CSS code, and underneath that, I'm gonna select the points class inside the about section, open that, and first thing I want to do here is change width to 300 pixels. Then I want to set top to 65% and left to 30%, and finally I want to change opacity to 0.1. I think we should do 80% here, save that, and that's it for the points image. Now I want to make some space underneath the section so we can scroll down. For that, I'm gonna come to the HTML, and underneath the about section, I'm gonna create a new section, and inside the style attribute, I'm gonna set min height to 2000 pixels. Hit save, and as you can see, we can now scroll down. Great, now let's go back to the pre-made version of the website, and let's reload the page. So when I scroll down to the about section, the progress bars were empty. Then when I keep scrolling, they filled up smoothly like that. So that's what we're going to do now. So first, each progress bar here is going to have a different fill-in value than the other one. For that, I'm gonna go back to the HTML code, and for each skill progress div here, I'm gonna add a custom attribute named DataProgress, in which I'm gonna specify the fill-in value in percentage. So for this one, I'm gonna add 90%. Let's copy and paste that here. Let's paste that here as well. So for this one, we want to have 70%, and for this one, we want to have 80%. Now I'm gonna move to our JavaScript file, and first thing I want to do here is select the skills div. So I'm gonna create a constant that I will name skills_wrap, and inside of it, we want to store the skills div. So we're gonna set document.querySelector.skills. After that, I want to select each skill progress div we have here. So underneath that, I'm gonna create another constant with name skills_bars, and inside, we're gonna say document.querySelector. And since we want to select a group of elements, we're gonna add here all, open parentheses, then we're gonna say .skill progress. Now every time we scroll, we need to check if we exceeded the skills div or not. For that, I'm gonna create here a function that I will name checkScroll. Then inside the parentheses, I'm gonna pass through one parameter that I will name EL. So every time we call this function, we're gonna specify inside that parameter the element that we want to check if we exceeded it or not. So right now we're gonna use that function to check if we exceeded the skills div or not. For that, when I call this function later, I will add inside the parentheses skills_wrap, which refers to the skills div. Now inside of that, we need first to know the top position of the skills div relative to the viewport. In other words, we need to get the amount of pixels between the skills div and the top edge of the window. For that, I'm going to create here a constant that I will name rect, and inside of it, we're going to take our element, then we're going to add to it the getBoundingClientRect method. So this method will return us an object containing properties about our element. This includes things such as width, height, top, left, right, bottom values, and so on. So for now, we want to get the top value. So I'm going to add here a console.log, and inside of that, we're going to say rect to refer to our object. Then we can access to the top position by adding here .top. Great. Now we still need to call this function. So as I said before, we're going to run this function every time we scroll the page. For that, I'm going to take the window object. Then I want to give it an event listener of scroll. So every time we scroll the page, we're going to call the checkScroll function. And the element that we want to check if we exceeded it or not is the skills div. So I'm going to add here skills_wrap. Now let's save that and let me open the console here. So now as you can see here, as I scroll down, I get closer to the skills div. For that, the value shown in the console decreases gradually. And that represents the amount of pixels between the skills div and the top edge of the window. Then if I scroll up, we get farther from the skills div. For that, the value increases. Now if I exceed here the top edge of the skills div, the value shown in the console turns negative. And that's because the top edge of the skills div becomes above the top edge of the window. So if I scroll up a little bit here, you will notice that at this point the value turns negative or positive. Great. Now after we know the amount of pixels between the top edge of the skills div and the top edge of the window, we can now move on and check if we exceeded the bottom edge of the skills div or not. To do that, we're going to use here an if statement. So let's add if, parentheses, then in between those parentheses, we're going to specify our condition. So in our case, we want to check if the window height is greater or equal to the sum of top position of the skills div and its height. Now we can get the window height by saying here window.inner height. Let's add greater or equal to. Then we want to get the top position of the skills div. So like we did before, we're going to say rect.top plus, then we need to get the height of the skills div. For that, I'm going to say here el to refer to our element. Then we're going to add .offset height to get its height. So if the window height is greater or equal to the sum of our element's height and its top position, we want them to display on the console hello. Now to understand more this condition, I'm gonna also console.log the value of that window.inner height. Now as you can see, we add that outside the if statement, which means the console is going to be writing this every time we scroll the page, unlike this hey message, which is going to be shown only if we exceeded the bottom edge of the skills div. Hit save, and as you can see, we already get that hey message in the console. And that's because we already exceeded the skills div. Now if I scroll up here, we don't get any more that hey message, and that's because we are currently above the skills div. In addition to that, the console is showing also 1080, which is the value of window.inner height, and that's exactly the height of my viewport. Great. Now I'm gonna console.log el.offset height instead, and let's see what we will get. So as you can see, we get in the console 157. Which is exactly the height of the skills div. Alright. Now I'm gonna console.log the sum of our element top position and its height, and let's see what we have this time. So as you can see here, at this point the sum is equal to 1752. So since the sum is greater than 1080, which is the window height, the console is not showing the hey message. Now I'm gonna scroll down, and as you can see, the sum decreases gradually, but it's still greater than the window height. But when I will reach the bottom edge of the skills div, the sum becomes approximately equal to 1080, which is our window height. For that, at this point, the console shows hey. Then if I keep scrolling down, the sum becomes less than 1080. For that, the console keeps showing the hey message. Great. So now, after checking if we exceeded the skills div or not, let's move on and add the fill-in animation to the progress bars. So back here, if this condition is true, instead of displaying hey in the console, I want the function to return a true value. Otherwise, if this condition is not true, then I want the function to return a false value. Let's remove that. So now every time we scroll the page, instead of calling this check scroll function, we're gonna call another function that we will name skills effect, in which we're gonna add the fill-in animation. Great. And now let's go ahead and create this function. So underneath that, we're gonna say function skills effect. Let's open that. And now before we do anything inside this function, we need first to check what is that function returning. Is this returning a true value, or is it returning a false value? So if it's returning a true value, that means we exceeded the bottom edge of the skills div. So we're going to execute the skills effect function. Instead, if it's returning a false value, that means we have not yet exceeded the skills div. So we are not going to execute our function. For that, at the beginning of our function, we're going to add an if statement. Then for the condition, we want to check if the check scroll function is returning a false value. So I'm going to add here an exclamation mark, which refers to the not operator. Then we're going to add the check scroll function with skills_wrap as a parameter. So here it's like we said if check scroll function is equal to false. So if it's equal to false, then we're going to say here return. And what does that do is it will end the function execution, which means if the check scroll function is returning a false value, then all the code we're going to specify below that will not be executed. Alright, now after we check that this is not returning a false value, we're going to check the skills_bars variable which contains all the skill progress divs. Then for each element inside of it, I'm going to check that element and name it skill. Then I'm going to say skill.style.width, and here I want to set its width to the value of its data progress attribute. So we can do that by saying here skill.dataset.progress, save that. But before switching to Google Chrome, I'm going to go inside the CSS file. Then I'm going to change width to 0%, which means at the moment when we reload the page, all the skill progress divs will have a width of 0%. Hit save, and here as you can see we are below the skills div, which means if I scroll up here, you will notice that those purple bars are already there. But if I go up here and reload the page, then if I scroll down, you will notice that you have not anymore those purple bars, and that's because we set their width to 0%. But if I exceed the bottom edge of the skills div, then the purple bars show up, and that's because the width of each purple bar here is now set to the value of its data progress attribute. Great. Now we still need to add some transition to make this looks like a fill-in animation, as you can see here. So all we have to do is come here and add a transition of 1 second. Save that and let me reload the page. So now I'm gonna scroll down a little bit and there is the fill-in animation. Okay, so with that we're done from the about section. Now it's time to move to the next section, which is this one right here that we will name the record section. So I'm gonna go back to our HTML file and let's first remove that because we don't need it anymore. Now I'm gonna create a new section with class of records. Let's open that. Then here we're gonna add the container div. And inside of it, we're gonna add another div with class of wrap. So this is going to be the wrapper of the circle that you see here. Let's open that. Then here we're gonna have a div with class of record circle, which is going to be the actual circle as you can see here. Now inside the circle, we're gonna first have a number. So I'm gonna create an h2 tag with class of number. Then here we're gonna say 235. After that, we want to have a small title. So underneath we're gonna say h4.subtitle, and let's add here projects. Now since we want to have 4 circles, I'm gonna copy and paste that underneath. Now for the second circle, we're gonna change that number to 174 and the title to happy clients. Let's do the same thing here. So we're gonna change that to 892 and that to work hour. And finally for this one, we're gonna change the number to 368 and the title to awards. Now let's save that and here we go. Nice. Now let's style that. So I'm gonna go inside the CSS file, and as we do with the other sections, we're gonna add here a new comment that says records. Then here we're gonna add another one that says end records. I want first to select the records section. So I'm gonna say here dot records. Then I want to give it a position of relative. I also want to give it a background color of the main color variable. And finally, let's add some padding of 5.2 rem in top and bottom and 0 in left and right. Save that and there we go. Now we want to make this in a row, as you can see here. For that, I'm going to select the container div, which is the parent. Then I'm going to give it a display of grid. This way we can add columns and rows inside of that container div. So in our case, we want to add 4 columns. For that, I'm going to say here grid template columns. And since our columns will have the same size as you can see here, I'm going to use the repeat function. Then inside of that, we need first to specify the number of columns we want. So let's add 4, comma. Then here we need to specify how wide our columns will be. So I'm going to say 1 of r, which means it will split the available space into 4 equal parts, and each column will take 1 part of that available space. Now we need to make sure that everything inside the columns will be aligned in the center. For that, I'm going to set here align items to center, justify content to center, and text align to center as well. Save that, and now as you can see, we have 4 columns. Great. Now I want to make some space between these columns. For that, I'm going to use here the grid column gap property, and I want to set that to 1.5 rem. I'm also going to add a grid row gap of 2 rem, because later on the small screens, the circles will not be displayed horizontally as a row like we have now. Instead, they're going to be displayed vertically as a column. So we added this to make sure that we're going to have some space on top and bottom of each circle. Great. But before seeing what we get, I'm going to give each wrap div a background color of red. This way you can see better what's going on. Save that now. And as you can see, we have some space between the columns. Let's remove that. So now we're going to select each record circle div we have. And first thing we want to do is give them a width of 180 pixels and a height of 180 pixels as well. I'm also going to set border radius to 50%. This way we're going to turn them into circles. And finally, I'm going to give each one of them a white background color. Save that, and there we go. Now we need to make sure that every circle here is going to be aligned in the middle of its column. For that, I'm going to set here margin to 0 for top and bottom, and also for left and right. Hit save, and now they are in the middle. Now instead of having this white background color, we want to have a white border. For that, I'm going to remove this white background, and instead I'm going to add here a border of 4 pixels, solid, and we're going to use the light one variable color. Alright, now we want to move everything inside the circles to the center. To do that, we're going to give each circle a display of flex. Then we want to set flex direction to column to make sure the flex items will be displayed vertically as a row. And finally, I'm going to set justify content to center to push the flex items to the center. Save that, and there we go. Now I also want to change color to the light one variable. Hit save, and here we go. Now if I go back here, you will notice that the second circle is different from the others. For that, I'm going to give it a second class of active, then I will use that class in CSS to select and style the specific circle. So let's go back to our CSS file and select the record circle with class of active. Then let's come here and add that active class to the second circle div. Now first thing we want to do is give it a background color of the light one variable, like so. We also want to change color to the dark one variable. And finally, we want to add the shadow. So I'm going to say box shadow. Then I'm going to set horizontal offset to 0, vertical offset to 0 as well. I'm also going to set shadow blur to 0. Let's also add a spread of 15 pixels. And finally, let's set shadow color to RGBA 255, 255, 255, then 0.5, which is a transparent white color. Let's save that. And there we go. Now I want to style these numbers. So underneath that, I'm going to select the number class. Then I'm going to give it a font weight of 400 and a font size of 2.35 rem, like so. Now I'm going to style these titles that we have below the numbers. So I'm going to say here that subtitle, open that. Then here I want first to set font weight to 400, font size to 1.12 rem to make them a little bit bigger. And finally, I want to set text transform to uppercase to turn all the letters into uppercase. Save that, and that's it. Let's come here. So now I'm gonna add those geometric shapes that we have in the background, and I will be back when I'm done. Alright, so now after we add the geometric shapes in the background, let me just go back here and reload the page. So next up, we're going to create this animated counter. So basically, we're going to have these numbers as you can see here. But if I reload the page and scroll down to the record section, you can see that it starts at 0 and then it animates up. So that's what we're going to build now. For that, I'm going to go back to our HTML file, and here I'm going to change all these values to 0. Because as we just saw, the counters will start at 0. So let's change this number to 0. Then I'm going to place the number that I just removed in a custom attribute that I will name DHAKA. This way we can access that number later on JavaScript. Let's do the same thing here. So we're going to say DHAKA, then inside we're going to put our number. And let's not forget to add 0 here. For the third counter, we're going to also change that to 0. Then here we're going to say DHAKA 892. Same thing for the fourth counter. And we're going to add here DHAKA 368. Hit save, and as you can see, the counters are showing now 0. Okay, so the first step now is that every time we scroll the page, we need to check if we exceed the record section or not. To do that, we're going to move to our JavaScript file, and first thing we need to do here is bring in the record section element. So we're going to create a new constant named records_wrap. Then here we're going to say document.querySelector.records. After that, we need to get each number div here. So we're going to create a new constant named records_numbers. Then here we're going to say document.querySelectorAll.number. Now every time we scroll the page, we're going to call here a second function named CountUp, which is the function we're gonna be using to make our counting animation. Now I'm gonna come underneath that and create our function. Let's open that. Then here, before we do anything, we need first to check if we exceeded the record section or not. So if we didn't exceed the record section, that means we will not start the counting animation. Now we can simply do that by copying this line and paste it here, and just change this to records underscore wrap. So basically here, if this check scroll function is returning a false value, that means we have not yet exceeded the records section. So all the code that we're going to specify below will not be executed. Great. So now if we exceeded the record section, we're gonna console.log a hey message. Save that. But before moving to our page, I'm gonna add here a new section tag that I will give a min height of 1600 pixels. This way we're gonna have some space below the record section. Save that now. And as you can see, at this point the console is not showing anything, and that's because we are above the record section. But if I scroll down and exceed the record section, the console shows then the hey message. Great. So now after we make sure that we exceeded the record section, we can go ahead and make those counters animate up. So back here inside our function, I'm gonna check our numbers, then I'm gonna loop through them. So for each number, we're gonna have a function here called update count. Then inside of this function, we need first to get the current value of each counter. So whatever this is, we want to grab that and put it into a variable. So we're gonna say let current num, and we're gonna set this to num.innerChecks. So that will grab whichever inside that number div. Now we're gonna console.log that, and then we're gonna call update count right here. Hit save, and as you can see, the console is showing 0 4 times, which is the actual value of these counters. Now to make sure this is going to be a number and not a string, I'm gonna add here a plus sign. Let's take a look, and nothing changes except for the type, which is now a number. Now we need to get the target value or the maximum number that each counter will hit. So we're gonna have a new variable here named max number, and inside of this variable we're gonna add a plus sign to make sure this is going to be a number. Now as you can see, for each number div here, we put its maximum number in an attribute that we named DataNum. So we can simply access that attribute by saying here num.dataset.num. Then we're gonna console.log this, and it should show us 4 values here. So as you can see, each value represents the maximum number of each counter here. Great. Now we're also gonna have a third variable named speed, which I'm gonna set to 100. And this is basically going to be what we divide the maximum number by to get the increment value. Because for each counter here, we want to have some kind of increment to count by, right? So basically, the lower this is, the faster it will count up. So now after we have the speed value and the maximum number, we can go ahead and calculate that increment value. So we're going to create a constant named increment. Then we can just take the maximum number and divide it by whatever our speed is. Okay, now to make sure the result is going to be an integer, I'm going to put that inside a mat.sale method, and it should now return an integer. Great. Now I can go ahead and console.log this. And as you can see, the console is showing 4 values, which are 3, 2, 9, and 4. So basically, 3 is the increment value of the first counter, and 2 is the increment value of the second counter. 9 is the increment value of the third counter, and finally 4 is the increment value of the fourth counter. Now I'm going to change the speed value to 300, and as you can see, the console is showing smaller values, which means it will count up much slower this time. So I think I'm just going to leave it 100. Great. So now after we have the increment value, we want to count up from that. But first, we need to have an if statement here because we don't want it to just keep counting up. We want it to stop if it reaches the maximum number. So let's say if the current number is less than the maximum number, then we're going to take the number div and make its inner checks equal to whatever the current number is plus the increment value. After that, we need to keep calling this update count function so the counters keep counting up. For that, we're going to use here a setTimeout, and what setTimeout does is it runs a function after a specified number of milliseconds. So we're going to run update count after 1 millisecond. And yeah, so as long that the current number is less than the maximum number, each counter will add the increment number to its current number. Then it will wait 1 millisecond and call that function again, and so on. Now let's save that. And let me just reload the page. So as you can see, at this point, each counter shows 0. But then when I'm gonna exceed the record section, they will start counting up. Great. But we still have a problem here. So as you can see, the third counter has exceeded its maximum number, which is 892. So to fix that, we're gonna add here an else statement. So else, if the current number reaches the maximum number, then we just want to display whatever that maximum number is. So we will say num.innerText, and we will set that to max number. Save that. And as you can see, the problem is now fixed. Great. Now I also want to wait 400 milliseconds before we run this function for the first time. So I'm gonna say here set timeout, and I want to run update count after 400 milliseconds. Hit save, and let me reload the page. So now when I will come to the record section, the counters will wait 400 milliseconds, then they will start counting up. And yeah, I think that's it for the record section. Now we're gonna move on to the next section, which is the block section, as you can see here. So let's go back into our HTML, and underneath the record section tag, we're gonna have another section tag with class of blog. I'm also going to add the second class of section because we want to have some padding in top and bottom. Now I'm gonna open that and add the container div, just like we did with every section before. Then inside of that, we're gonna first have the section header div, where we're gonna have the title and that small text. So let's add first an h3 tag with class of title, and let's say here my blog. Then for the data title attribute, we're gonna add last news. So that's what we are going to have above the title. Just after that, we're gonna have a paragraph tag with class of text. Open that. Then here I'm gonna paste this text. Save that. And there is the section header div. Now just underneath the section header div, we're gonna have a second div with class of blog wrapper. So this is basically where we will have the blog cards. Now each blog card div here is going to have a wrapper div that we will name blog wrap. So back here we're gonna add a div with class of blog wrap. Then inside of that we will have the actual card. So we're gonna create here a div with class of blog card. Now inside the card we will first have an image. For that I'm gonna add here a div with class of blog image. Then in this div we're gonna add an image tag, and here we will go inside the image folder and pick the blog1.png image. Great. Now underneath that we're gonna have another div with class of blog content. So basically this is going to be the container of this date, the card title, and all this stuff. Now first thing we want to add is this date right here and this user checks. So let's go back here and add a div with class of blog info. Then inside of this div we're gonna first have an h5 tag with class of blog date, and we're gonna say here March 19, 2020. Then underneath that we're gonna have another h5 tag, but this time with class of blog user, and here we want first to add the user icon. So we're gonna use an I tag here with the font awesome class of FAS and a class of FA-user. So that will be our icon. Let's also add admin here, like that. Now after the blog info div, we're gonna have an h3 tag with class of title SM. Then here we're gonna say this is a short title. We're also going to have below that a paragraph tag with class of blog text. Then in here I'm gonna paste this text. Now we still need to add the read more button. So underneath that I'm gonna add an anchor tag with class of btn and the second class of small, because we want to have a smaller button. Then here we're gonna say read more. And I think that's it for the first blog card. Let's save that. And there we go. So now I'm gonna copy that and paste it underneath. And I want first to change the image right here. Then I'm gonna change this date. And finally I'm gonna change this text. Let's add the third card below that. And we also want to change the image, this date. And finally we want to change this text. Save that. And as you can see we have 3 different cards. Now we're gonna style all this stuff. So let's jump back into our CSS, and here we want first to add a blog comment, copy and paste that, and then we're gonna change that to end blog. Now in here we're gonna first select the blog wrapper div, which is the parent of these 3 blog wrap divs. Then in here we want first to set display to flex. This way all the cards will go in a row as you can see here. Now we have to give these cards a specific width, so I'm gonna select here the block card div. Then inside of that I'm gonna set max width to 420 pixels. I'm also going to set width to 100%. This way if the screen goes smaller and the cards cannot fit anymore in the screen, it will automatically resize them to fit in the screen. Save that. And as you can see, all the cards are now 420 pixels wide. Now we need to make some space between these cards, so we're gonna go back to the wrapper div and we will first make sure that the width is set to 100%. Then we're gonna set justify content to space around. Hit save and there we go. Now I'm gonna set flex wrap to wrap. This way when there is no more enough space for the last card, it will go down into a new line. Now as you can see, that happens at the point when the cards get attached, but we don't want that. Instead, we want to have some margin in left and right of each card. This way the last card will go down into a new line at the point when the margins get attached. So all we need to do is come here and select the block wrap div, which is the container of the card div as you can see here. Then we're gonna give it a margin of 1.3 rem in top and bottom and 0.5 rem in left and right. Save that, and there we go. Great. Now inside the block card stylings, I'm gonna add an overflow of hidden just to make sure that whatever goes beyond the card will be hidden. Then I'm gonna give it a background color of the light show variable, which is a light purple color. Hit save. I don't know if you can notice that or not, but the cards are having now some background color. Great. Now we need to give these images a specific height. So back here I'm going to select the block image div, which is the image container, and inside of that I want first to make sure that the width is set to 100%. Then I'm going to give it a height of 270 pixels. I'm also going to set position to relative and overflow to hidden to make sure that any part of the image that goes beyond this div will be hidden. And finally, let's add here a background color of red. This way we can see better what's going on. Hit save. And as you can see, the third image is having now a height of 270 pixels. But the first and the second images are not. And that's because they are smaller than their container divs. So to fix that, we have to make those images bigger. For that, we're going to select the image tag, like so. We're going to first set position to absolute. This way we can size and move the image however we want inside its container div, which is the block image div. After that, we want to give each image a height of 105%. This way the images are going to be bigger than their containers. I'm also going to set width to initial because these images are already having a width of 100%. So to delete this value, I reset here width to initial. Now let's save that. And as you can see, all the images are having now a height of 270 pixels. Now we have to center each image here inside its container div. So all we have to do is move the images 50% from top and left, then move them backwards by translating them minus 50%. Save that, and that's it for the card's images. Let's keep going. So now we're going to select the block content, which is the container of all the stuff below the card image. Then here I want first to set padding to 2.1 rem for top, 2.2 rem for right, 2.7 rem for bottom, and 2.2 rem again for left, like so. After that, I'm going to select the block info div, which is the container of the date and the user text. Then here we want first to set display to flex. This way the user text will be on the side of the date div. I'm also going to set flex wrap to wrap, just in case if there is no enough space for the user text, it will go down into a new line. And finally, let's give this a margin bottom of 0.5 rem. Hit save. And as you can see, the user text is now on the side of the date div. Great. Now we're gonna say here block info h5, which basically gonna select both date and user text because they are both h5 tags. Open that. Then here we're gonna first change the color to the main color variable. We're also gonna add a font weight of 400 to make them lighter, a text transform of uppercase, a font size of 1.05 rem, and finally let's add a letter spacing of 2 pixels to make some space between the letters. Hit save, and there we go. Now I'm gonna select the block date class. Then here I want to give it a margin right of 2 rem. Save that, And as you can see, we have now some margin on the right of the date checks. After that, I want to select this user icon. So I'm going to say here that block user I, and inside of that, I'm going to set margin right to 0.2 rem and font size to 1 rem. Great. Now we want to style that text underneath the title. So we're going to select here the block text class, and inside of that, we're going to first set margin to 0.5 rem for top, 0 for right, 1.5 rem for bottom, and 0 for left, like so. We're also going to change font size to 1.2 rem, line height to 1.6, and finally, let's change the color to 666. Save that, and yeah. Now let's move on and add this hover animation on the cards. So first, I'm going to go back here inside the block card div, and I'm going to add a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then underneath that, I'm going to select again the block card div, but this time I'm going to add colon hover. So when we hover on a card, we want to translate it in the y-axis by minus 15 pixels, which means it's going to move it backwards by 15 pixels. Hit save, and there we go. Now we also want to show this purple line just like we have in the services cards. So we're going to add here a position of relative because we want to position that line relatively to this block card div. Then underneath that, we're going to have an after pseudo element. So we're going to set here content to an empty pair of quotes and position to absolute. Then I'm going to give it a width of 100% and a height of 8 pixels. And to make sure this is going to be aligned in the bottom, I'm going to add here bottom 0 and left 0. And finally, let's not forget to give this a background color of the main column. Save that, and as you can see, each card is having now that purple line in the bottom. Now we need to hide this, then show it if we hover on the card. So we're going to first add here a transition of 0.3 seconds, then below that we're going to select again the block card div. So when we hover on the card, we're going to take the after pseudo element, which is the purple line, then we're going to change its height to 8 pixels. So now this is going to show the line when we hover on the card. Now all we have to do is come here and hide it by changing its height to 0 pixels. Hit save, and as you can see, we cannot see any more those purple lines, but when I'm gonna hover on a card, the line will show up. Nice. Now I also want to zoom the image when we hover on the card. So to do that, I'm gonna first give the image a transition of 0.5 seconds. Then below that, I'm gonna select the block card div. So when we hover on the card, we're gonna take the image tag. Then here we want to keep its translation value, and we're gonna add a scaling of 1.15. Hit save, and now when I'm gonna hover on a card, the image inside will zoom in. Great. Let's come here. So now we're gonna add this square shape that you have behind the first block card. And yeah, I think that's it for the blog section. Now the next section is going to be the testimonials. So here we're gonna have this oil carousel where we can go through the client's reviews. So let's go back here. And before doing anything, I'm just gonna close all these section tags. Great. So now underneath that, we're gonna have a new section tag with class of testimonials and a class of section. After that, we're gonna have the container div. Then in here, we're gonna first create the section header div where we're gonna have the section title. So let's add here an h3 tag with class of title, and let's say testimonials. Then for the data title attribute, we're gonna have what people say. Let's save that, and there is the section title. Great. Now below that, we're gonna have a new div with class of test content, then a second class of grade 2, because we're gonna have the carousel in the left and an image in the right. So we kinda want to create two columns inside this div. That's why I gave it this grade 2 class. Let's keep going. So now inside of that, we're gonna have two main divs. One for the carousel, so we're gonna add here a div with class of column 1 and the class of reviews. and the other one is for the image. So we're gonna add below that a div with class of column2 and the class of image. Now inside this reviews div, we're gonna have the client's reviews. So we're gonna add here a div with class of review, open that, and inside of that review div, we're gonna first have this rating stars. So let's add here a div with class of rate. Then in here, we're gonna have 5-star icons. So we're gonna use an tag with font awesome class of FAS and a class of FA-star. And since we want 5-star icons, I'm gonna multiply this by 5. Just after the rate div, we're gonna have a small text. So we're gonna add here a paragraph tag with the class of review text. Then inside of that, I will paste this text, like so. Underneath that, we're gonna have another div with the class of review info. Then in here, we're gonna first add an h3 tag with the class of review name. So let's say here matches batch. And below that, we're gonna add an h5 tag with class of review job. And here, we're just gonna have a random job and a random city. Hit save. Let's scroll down here. And there is the review div. Now inside the image div, we're gonna add an image tag with class of image element. Then here, we're gonna go inside the image folder and pick the test.png image. Save that, and now we have that image in the right. Great. Now we're gonna go inside the CSS file, and down here, we're gonna first add the testimonials comment. Like that. So now I'm gonna say here the testimonials to select the testimonials section. Then inside of that, we want to give it a background color of the light2 variable. And we also want to set overflow to hidden. Save that, and as you can see, the background color has now changed. Let's go back here. So now underneath that, I'm gonna select the test content div, which is, as you can see here, the container of all the stuff below the section header div. Let's open that. Then here, we want to give it a margin top of 6 rem. Save that, and now we have some margin on top of that. Let's keep going. So now we're gonna select the review div. Then in here, we want to give it a padding of 2 rem in top and bottom, and 1.5 rem in left and right. Hit save, and there we go. Now I want to start this rating stars. So first I'm gonna select here the rate div, which is the container of all those star icons. Then in here we want to set display to flex to make sure that the icons will be on the side of each other. I also want to set font size to 1.4 rem to make them a little bit bigger. After that, I'm gonna change their color to EBC000, which is a yellow color. And finally, let's give this rate div a margin bottom of 1.5 rem. Save that, and there we go. Now we need to make some space between these icons. So back here, I'm gonna select each tag inside the rate div. Then in here, we want to give them a margin right of 0.3 rem. Save that, and that's it. Now we want to style that text below the rating stars. For that, I'm gonna select here the review text class, open that. Then here we want to change its font size to 1.35 rem. We also want to change its font weight to 300 to make the text lighter. Let's also change the color to 444. And finally, let's give it a line height of 1.7. Hit save, and there we go. Now I'm gonna select the review info div, which is the container of all the stuff below the review text. Then in here, I want to give it a margin top of 2 rem. Save that, and as you can see, we have now some space below the review text. Great. Now we're gonna select the review name class. Then inside of that, we want to change the font size to 1.3 rem, font weight to 700, and finally, we want to change its color to the dark one variable. Save that, and there we go. After that, we want to style that little text underneath the review name. So we're gonna select here the review job class. Then inside of that, we're gonna first change font size to 1.15 rem, font weight to 300, and finally color to 777. Save that, and that's it. Let's come here. So now we still need to add that code icon that we have behind the rating stars. For that, we're gonna go back to our CSS file, and inside the review div stylings, we're gonna first add a position of relative, and that's because we are going to give that code icon a position absolute. So we want to make sure that it's going to be relative to this review div. Now I'm gonna go inside the HTML file, and above the rate div, I'm gonna add an a tag with the font awesome class of FAS and FA-code-left. Let's also add a third class of code, which we're going to be using in CSS. Press tab, and that will be the code icon. Hit save, and now we have that code icon above the rating stars. Great. So now inside the CSS file, we're gonna select below that the code icon. Then in here, we want first to give it a position of absolute. This way we can move it however we want inside the review div. In our case, we want to move it to the top left corner. For that, I'm gonna add here top 0 and left 0. Save that, and now it's on top left corner. After that, we want to change color to the main color variable. We also want to decrease the opacity to 0.04. And finally, let's change font size to 8 rem. This way the icon will be much bigger. Hit save, and there we go. Now we're gonna have more than one client review. For that, I'm gonna go back here, then I'm gonna copy that and paste it underneath. And let's change the review text as well as the review name and the review job. Let's paste it another time. So we're gonna do the same thing here. Then let's add the fourth review div below that, and let's make sure we change it all of that. Hit save. But I think this review div should not be in the second column, so I guess I missed something here. Let me just close all these tags, and yeah, we should add those review divs inside the column 1 div. Save that, and the problem is now fixed. Great. So now to convert this into a slider, we're gonna use a JavaScript library called Swipper. So let's search here for Swipper.js, then let's go here, and there is the library website. So let's open the getting started page, and as you can see here, if you want to use this library in our website, we need first to add some Swipper files inside our HTML. So first we have the CSS file. For that, we're gonna copy that and paste it here. Then we have the JavaScript file, so let's copy that as well and paste it down here. Save that, and as you can see, nothing has changed yet. Let's go back here. So now we need to add the Swipper layout to our HTML. So first we're gonna have on top of that a main container that we will name Swipper container. Let's move all of this into here. After that, we need to put all of these review divs inside our wrapper div. So we're gonna add here a div with class of Swipper wrapper. Then we're gonna move all of this again inside of that div. And finally, let's give each review div here a class of Swipper slide. Hit save, and there we go. But this is not working yet, and that's because we still need to initialize the library in JavaScript. So let's go back here, but before doing that, I'm gonna give the reviews div, which is this whole thing right here, an overflow of hidden, just to make sure that the slice that will go beyond this will be hidden. Now we're gonna go inside the JavaScript file, and as you can see here, if you want to initialize Swipper inside our JavaScript, we need to use this following function. So down here, we're gonna have a variable with name mySwipper, and in here we can initialize the library by saying new Swipper. Then inside these parentheses, we're gonna have two parameters. In the first one, we need to specify which element is the Swipper container. So let's add here .swipper-container. Then in the second parameter, we need to add the options object. So basically in this object, we're gonna modify all the options of our slider. For now, I will just leave it empty until I come back later. Save that. And now after we initialize the library, we can navigate using our cursor. Great. Now back here inside the options object, we want first to change the slider speed. So we're gonna set here the speed option to 1100 milliseconds. I also want to make sure that we can see only one slide at the same time. So I'm gonna set here slides per view to 1. After that, I'm gonna set the loop option to true. This way we're gonna enable the loop mode. And finally, we want the slider to autoplay every 5 seconds. So we're gonna set autoplay to an object with one option, which is delay, and let's set that to 5000 milliseconds. Save that. And after 5 seconds, the slider will move just like that. Great. Now we need to add the navigation buttons. So let's go back here, and as you can see, we need to add two divs below the Swipper wrapper. One for the previous button, and the other one for the next button. So let's go inside our HTML file, and underneath the Swipper wrapper, we're gonna add a new div with class of review nav and a class of Swipper-button-previous. Then inside of this div, we want to have this left arrow icon. So we're gonna use here an I tag with the font awesome class of FAS and FA-arrow-alt-left. Press sub and that will be the previous button. Now for the next button, we're just gonna copy that and paste it underneath and just change this class to swiper button next and this icon to right. This way we're gonna have a right arrow icon. Save that, and as you can see the navigation buttons have now been added, but they are not working yet. And that's because we still need to do something else in JavaScript. But before moving on to JavaScript, I wanna get rid of these big chevrons that were added by default. So to select these chevrons, we're gonna say here .swiper-button-prev column after, and that will select the chevron icon that you have in the previous button. Just after that, I'm gonna say .swiper-button-next column after, and that will select the one we have in the next button. So now to get rid of them, we just have to add here display none. Save that, and now they are gone. Great. So now I want to move these buttons to the right. For that, I'm gonna select here the next button, like so. Then inside of that, I'm gonna set right to rem and left to initial to make sure it's not having any left value. Let's do the same thing for the previous button. So we're gonna change right to 4.5 rem. Hit save, and nothing happens. So I think we missed something here. Let me just figure it out. And yeah, the problem was here. So the swiper CSS file should be above our main style.css file. Save that now, and there we go. Let's move them now to the bottom. So we're gonna say here .reviewNav to select both navigation buttons. Then in here we're gonna set bottom to 2.2 rem and top to initial to remove any previous top value. Hit save, and that's it. Now we want to make them a little bit bigger, so we just have to change font size to 1.8 rem. We're also going to change their color to the main color variable. Save that, and yeah, now let's make this work. So all you have to do is come here inside the JavaScript file and just copy the navigation option that you have here, then paste it below that. Hit save, and now if I click on the next button, it will move to the next slide. And if I click on the previous button, it will move back to the previous slide. Let's close that. So that's pretty much all for the testimonial section. Now we're gonna add the next section, which is the contact section, as you can see here, where we're gonna have this contact form. So we're gonna go back here, and below the section tag, we're gonna add a new section with class of contact. Inside of that, we're gonna have, as usual, the container div. Then in here, we're gonna have another div with class of contact box. So basically, this is gonna be this whole white box. Now inside that box, as you can see, we have two parts. The part on left where we're gonna have the contact informations, and the part on right where we're gonna have the contact form. For that, we're gonna add here two divs. One for the left part, so let's name this contact info, and the other one is for the right part, so let's name this contact form. Now inside the first div, we're gonna have first a title. So let's add here an h3 tag with class of title. Then let's say here get in touch. And we're not gonna add a data title attribute for this title, and that's because we don't want to have anything above it. Just after that, we're gonna have a paragraph tag with a class of text. So I'm gonna paste here this text. Now underneath that, we're gonna have a div with class of information wrap. Let me come here. So basically, this is gonna be this whole area right here. And as you can see, we're gonna have inside of that three divs. For now, let's just add the first one. So each div here is gonna have an icon in left and a small text in right. Let's add that here. So we're gonna first create a div with class of information. Then in here, we need first to add that icon we have in left. So we're gonna create another div with class of contact icon. And we're gonna add inside of that a font awesome icon with the class of fa-map-marker, and that will give us a map icon. Just beside the icon, we're gonna have a small text. So we're gonna add below that a paragraph tag with the class of info text. Now for the first information div, we want to have an address. So I'm just gonna drop here a random address. Like so. Now that was the first information div. So let's add below that the second div and the third div. Great. Now inside the second div, we want to change this icon to a paper plane icon, and we also want to change this address to a random email. And finally for the third div, we're gonna change that to a phone icon and this to a random phone number. Great. So that's it for the first part. Now let's move on to the second part where we're gonna have the contact form. So inside this contact form div, we're gonna first have a title. So let's say here contact me. After that, I'm gonna add a div with class of row. Then in here, we're gonna add two inputs. The first one will have a type of text and the class of contact input, which is the class we're gonna give to all the inputs. And finally, it's gonna have a placeholder of first name. Now for the second input, we're just gonna copy that and paste it underneath and change placeholder to last name. Now the reason why I put these inputs inside that row div is because we're gonna have them both in one line. So I put them in a wrapper div. This way it's gonna be easy for us to make them in one row like that. Great. Now let's add these two inputs. So same story here, we need to put them as well in a wrapper div. For that, I'm just gonna copy this and paste it underneath. Then for this input, we wanted to have a placeholder of phone. And for this input, we want to change its type to email. And we wanted to have a placeholder of email. Great. Now next thing we need to add is this big message input. So back here, we're gonna add again the row div. Then inside of that, we're gonna create a text area tag. So it's the same as the input tag, except it's bigger and can hold a big data like a message. Now I'm gonna give this a name of message. Let's get rid of that. And since it will look the same as the other inputs, I'm gonna give it a class of contact input as well. I'm also going to add a second class of text area because it's gonna have some different stylings from the other inputs. And finally, let's give this a placeholder of message. Save that, and yeah, I think we still need to add the send button. So let's add it underneath that and let's say send. Hit save, and yeah, we have now the contact form. Let's keep going. Now we're gonna style that. So down here, we're gonna add the contact comment, like so. Then in here, we're gonna first select the contact section, open that, and here we want first to make sure it's having a width of 100%. Then we're gonna give it a padding of 13.5 rem in top, 0 in right, 8.5 rem in bottom, and 0 again in left. Now this is gonna have an image in the background, but for now, I'm just gonna set its background to the main color variable. Save that. And yeah, the background has been changed, and also we have some padding in top and bottom. Now I'm gonna select the contact box div. Then in here, we're gonna set width to 100%, background color to white. After that, we want to make sure it's taking the full width. So we're gonna set width to 100%. Just below that, we're gonna set border radius to 45 pixels. This way it's gonna have rounded corners. And finally, we're gonna give this a padding of 5.5 and 4.5 rem. Hit save, and there we go. Now we want to have the get in touch part in left and the contact form part in right. For that, I'm gonna set here display to grid. Then inside of that div, we want to create two even columns of 1fr. This way the get in touch part will take the first column and the contact form part will take the second column, just like so. Now we're gonna select the contact info div, which is the left part. Then in here, we want to give it a padding right of 2 rem. Let's copy that and paste it underneath. And this time, we're gonna select the contact form class, which is the right part. And we want to give it instead a padding left of 2 rem. This way, we're gonna have 4 rem of space in total between the contact info and the contact form. Now I want to move this line to the left. So back here, I'm gonna select the after pseudo element of the title. Then I'm gonna change left to 0 and I'm gonna set transform to initial. This way it's not gonna have any more that translate value. Hit save, and there we go. After that, I'm gonna select the information wrap div, which is the container of all the stuff below the text. Then in here, I want to give it a margin top of 2 rem. This way we're gonna have some space between the text and the other stuff. Great. Now we're gonna select every information div we have. Then in here, we want first to set display to flex. This way the text will be beside the icon. After that, we're gonna give it an align items of center to make sure both icon and text will be centered vertically, as you can see here. Now we want to add some margin bottom only to the first and the second information divs. So back here, we're gonna select again the information div, but this time we're gonna add not last child, which means all the stylings we're gonna specify inside of that will not be applied on the last child items, which is the third information div. Open that. Then here, all we have to do is add a margin bottom of 1.3 rem. Hit save, and there we go. We have now some space between the information divs. Let's go back here. So now we're gonna select the contact icon class, which is the container of the icon. Then in here, we want to give it a min width of 67 pixels. which means it cannot be smaller than that. We're also gonna give it a height of 67 pixels and a display of online block. After that, we're gonna set border radius to 50%. This way it will be rounded like a circle. And finally, let's give this a background color of the main color variable. Save that, and there we go. Now we need to move these icons to center. But before that, we need to change their color to white, like so. Now we're gonna set text align to center. This way they will be aligned horizontally in the middle. Let me just increase the font size to 1.4 rem. And yeah, now to move them down to the center, we just have to select here the actual icon, like so. Then give it a line height of 67 pixels, which is the container div's height. Hit save, and there we go. After that, we need to style the text beside these icons. So back here, I'm gonna first add a margin right of 1 rem. This way we're gonna have some space between the icon and the text. Now underneath that, we're gonna select the info text class, like so. And here we're gonna change font size to 1.4 rem. And we're gonna set display to online block. I think we should have here 1.3. Save that, and that's it. Next, we're gonna style this contact form. So we need first to hide this line just like we have here. For that, we're gonna say .contact form .title column after to select the after element of the title. Then inside of that, we're gonna set display to none. Save that, and now we don't have any more that line under the title. Now we're gonna select the actual title. Then here I want to remove its margin by saying here margin 0, like so. Great. After that, we're gonna select the row div, as you can see here. So basically, we have 3 rows here. And what we wanna do is stretch these inputs to fill the entire width of their row div. Now we can easily achieve that by adding first a width of 100%, then by giving the row div a display of grid. So now we can use the grid template columns property, and here we're gonna create 2 even columns of 1 FR. Hit save, and there we go. But the problem here is that the inputs will be too squished on smaller viewports, as you can see here. So to fix that, we need to specify a minimum width for our columns, making sure they don't go too narrow. Now we can do that using here the min-max function. So this is like saying, make sure my inputs don't go below 130 pixels, but allow them to expand as big as 1FR will allow. Now we will notice that this will cause overflow in the row, which is not actually what we want. So to fix that, we need to move down the last input into a new row when there is no longer available space. So instead of specifying here 2 columns, we're gonna let grid figure out how many columns we need by changing this to out of it. Which means at first there will be 2 columns, but at the point when the inputs will hit their minimum width, the second one will go down into a new line. Great. Now I'm gonna add here grid column gap of 0.6 rem. This way we're gonna have some spacing between the inputs, as you can see here. Now it's time to style these inputs. So below that, we're gonna select the contact input class. Then in here we want first to give them a padding of 1.2 and 2.1 rem and a margin of 0.6 rem in top and bottom. We also want to get rid of the border and the outline, like so. And finally, we want to give them a background of F3, F3, F3. Save that, and there we go. But the message input should also get those stylings. So I think we missed something here. And yeah, we should not have here a capitalized C. Save that now, and there we go. Let's keep going. So after that, we're gonna give the inputs a border radius of 4 rem, a font weight of 600, and finally a font size of 1.25 rem. Save that, and that's it. Now we want to style the placeholder text. So back here, we're gonna select again the contact input class, but this time we're gonna add the placeholder selection. So here we want to change the placeholder font weight to 400. This way it's gonna be lighter, as you can see here. Now we still need to modify this big message input. So back here we're gonna select the contact input with the class of text area. Then here we're gonna first set resize to none. So before I save that, you will notice that we're able to modify the text area size. But now when I'm gonna save that, we cannot do that anymore. Just underneath this, I'm gonna give it a min height of 280 pixels, and I will decrease the border radius to 2 rem. Save that, and there we go. Now we need to add some hover effect to these inputs. So back here, we're gonna select again the contact input class, but this time we're gonna add column hover. So inside of that, we're going to change background color to EC, which is slightly darker than the current color. Let me just add here a transition of 0.3 seconds. And yeah, now we also want to add an animation when we click on the inputs. So we're going to say here .contact input focus. Then inside of that, we're going to change again background to EA, which is even darker than the hover color. Now since we used here the background property, we have to use it again here. Hit save. And yeah, we have now the focus animation. I also want to give this a little bit of margin on top. So I'm going to say here .contact input.btn to select that button. Then inside of that, I'm going to set margin top to 0.6 rem. Save that, and there we go. Now it's time to change this background to what we have here. So as you can see, we're going to have two images in the background. For that, we're going to go back to the contact section settings, and here we need first to add the position of relative. And that's because we want to make sure that we position those two images relatively to this contact section. Now below that, we're going to create inside the contact section a before and after pseudo elements. So these will be our two images. Open that, then here I'm going to first set content to an empty pair of quotes, position to absolute. This way we can size and move our images however we want. Then I'm going to set width to 100%. I'm also going to give them a z-index of -1 to make sure they will be always behind the contact box. And finally, I'm going to add here left 0. Now below that, we're going to select the before element, which will be the first image. And here we want first to give it a top of 0. Then we want to give it a height of 40%. And last thing we want to do is add the actual image to that. So we're going to say here background. Then inside these parentheses, we're going to go inside the image folder and then take the map image. Let's add center to make sure the image will be centered inside this before element. And finally, let's add cover. This way the image will cover its entire container, which is the before element. Save that. I think we still need to remove here the background color. Let's see now, and there we go. Now let's add the second image. So we're going to select this time the outer element, and inside of that, we're going to first push the image 40% from top. This way it's going to be just underneath the first image. Then we're going to give it a height of 60%, so it takes the remaining height. And finally, we need to add the actual image to that. So same thing here, we're going to take the contact BG image, and this time we want it to be center bottom. Save that. And yeah, I think that's it for the contact section. So as you can see, we have now this contact form. Next, we're going to add the hire me section. So there is nothing important in this section. For that, I'm going to create it very quickly, and I will be back when I finish.
Step on the land, I've got your hand, and now we're way down, fade out low. Was it your plan? Can't understand. I love the air you bring, everything. Under the sun, a fire is burning. You tell me to hold on tight. I wish that we could stay here forever. I wanna remember all the sight of you brings the fight in me, makes me wanna move. Fingers down your spine, looking in my eyes, feel your hands on mine. Tonight we're freer than ever. I wanna remember. Oh, we run every endeavor. I wanna remember.
And yeah, that's it for the hire me section. Now we have reached the last part of our website, which is the footer section, as you can see here. So let's go back to our HTML file, and this time we're gonna come underneath the main tag like so, and we're gonna add a footer tag with the class of footer. So here you will notice that I added the footer tag outside the main tag, and that's because the main tag is where we have the actual content of the website. So the footer is kind of useless. We just have some additional information about the website and things of that sort. For that, we didn't add it inside the main tag. Let's keep going. So here we're gonna have the container div. Then inside of that, we're gonna have two main parts. So as you can see, the first part is this area right here where we have these 4 columns. Then below that, we have the second part that contains this copyright text and those social media icons. So going back here, we're gonna start by the first part. For that, I will create a div with the class of grid 4. So as I said before, we're gonna have inside of that 4 columns. That's why I named this grid 4. Open that. Then here we want to create a new div with class of grid 4 call, And again, since there will be 4 columns, I'm gonna multiply this by 4. Press tab, and yeah, we have now 4 divs, where each div here represents a column. Great. Now inside the first column, we want to have an about text. So let's give this a class of footer about. Then in here, we're gonna first have a small title of about, and below that, we're gonna have a small about text. So we're gonna create a paragraph tag with class of text. Then here, I'm gonna paste this random text. Now let's move to the second column. So here we want to have some nav links. For that, I'm gonna give this a class of footer links. Open that, and here we're gonna have a title of links. Then underneath that, we will create an unordered list. So this is where we're gonna add the nav links. Now in here, we're gonna have first the services link. Let's copy that and paste it underneath 4 times. Then we're gonna have the portfolio link, the about link, the testimonials link, and finally the contact link. Great. Now in the third column, we're gonna have again some links. So I'm gonna add here again the footer links class. Then inside of that, we're gonna have a title of services. So same thing here, we're gonna have again an unordered list. So let's start with the first link, and we're gonna name it web design. Copy that and let's paste it underneath like so. Now we're gonna change this to web dev, this to app design, we're gonna have here marketing, and finally let's do here UI design. After that, we're gonna have the newsletter column. So let's give this a class of newsletter. Then in here, we're gonna first have a title of subscribe. By the way, if you're not subscribed yet, go now subscribe to the channel if you want to see more tutorials just like this one. Just after that, we're gonna have a text. So let's do here a random lorem text. And finally, we're gonna have this email input. So as you can see, we have this transparent input field. Then beside it, we have this small submit button. For that, we're gonna add here a div with class footer input wrap. So this will be the container of the input and the submit button. Then in here, we're gonna have an input tag with class footer input. Press tab, and we want to give it a type of email and a placeholder of email as well. Now underneath that, we want to have the submit button. So we're gonna create an anchor tag with the class of input arrow. Then here we want to add the arrow icon. So we will use again an I tag with the font awesome class of FAS and FA-angle-right. And yeah, I think that's it. Save that. Let me just come here. And there we go. Now let's start styling that. So back here, we're gonna add the footer comment. Like so. Then in here, we're gonna first select the footer section. And what we wanna do is change the background color to 222. Then give it a padding of 6 rem in top and bottom. Save that. And yeah, we now have this dark background. And also we have some padding in top and bottom. After that, we need to create here 4 columns. So underneath this, we're gonna select the grid 4 class. Open that. And here, we're gonna first set display to grid. Then we're gonna use the grid template columns property to create 4 equal columns of 1FR. Save that. And as you can see, we have now 4 equal columns. But actually, we don't want them to be equal. So as you can see, we want the first and the last columns to be bigger. For that, we're gonna go back here. And this time, we're not gonna use the repeat function because we don't have any more equal columns. Instead, we're gonna specify each column width individually. So the first column width will be this time 3.5 FR. The second column width will be 2 FR. The third column will also have 2 FR. And finally, the fourth column will have 3 FR. Now to understand more what I did here, think of it as we divided the grid container into 10 equal parts and half. Then we gave the first column 3 parts and half, the second column 2 parts, the third column 2 parts, and finally we gave the fourth column the remaining 3 parts, which means now the first and the fourth columns will be bigger. Save that, and there we go. After that, we want to make some spacing between the columns. So I'm going to say here .grade4 call to select each column we have. Then inside of that, I'm going to set padding to 0 for top and bottom, and 1.7 rem for left and right. Hit save, and yeah. Now let's style these titles. So back here, we're going to select the title SM class. Then inside of that, I'm going to change color to FA, and I'm going to add a margin bottom of 0.9 rem, like so. After that, I want to style these texts. So below this, I'm going to say .footer.text. Then in here, we want to change color to AAA. Save that, and that's it. Now we're going to style these links. So back here, we're going to say .footer links A, open that, and here we want to change their color to 888 and their font size to 1.25 rem. This way they will be bigger as you can see here. After that, we're gonna set display to online block, and finally we will give each one of these links a margin bottom of 0.4 rem. Hit save, and there we go. Now we still need to add some hover effect to these links. For that, we're gonna first add here a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then below this, we're gonna select again the links, but this time we're gonna add column hover. So when we hover on the links, we want to change their color to the main color variable. Hit save, and that's it. Now let's move to this newsletter input. So underneath that, we're gonna select the folder input for wrap div, which is the container of the input and the submit button. Oh yeah, we should have here a dot. So this is the submit button I was talking about. I know it's hard to see it, but we will fix that later. So now what we want to do is expand this whole input div to fill the entire width of the column. Now the easy way to do that is by using again the grid. So let's first set display to grid. Then underneath that, we're going to use the grid template columns property. And here I want to create a big column for the input field and a small column for the submit button. For that, we will give the first column a width of auto, and we will give the second column a width of 50 pixels. Which means now the submit button will take 50 pixels from the entire width, and all the remaining width will go to the input field, as you can see here. Let me just change the submit button color to white, and there we go. Now underneath that, I want to make sure that this is always having a width of 100%. Then I'm gonna give it a height of 50 pixels. Save that. Let me just add here a background color of the main color variable. And there we go. After that, we want to have a border radius of 30 pixels. Then we're gonna add an overflow of hidden to make sure we hide everything goes beyond this input container. Save that. And yeah. Now we also want to add here a margin top of 1.2 rem, so we get some spacing between the input and the text above it. Great. Let's move now to this input field. So back here, we're gonna select the footer input class, as you can see here, and inside of that, we're gonna change background color to 373737, color to 333. Then we're gonna get rid of the outline and the border like so. We also want to add a padding of 1.5 rem in left and right. And finally, we're gonna increase font size to 1.1 rem. Save that. And there we go. After that, we need to style the submit button. And first thing we want to do is move this arrow icon to center. So I'm gonna set display to flex. Then I'm gonna add align item center and justify content center. Hit save, and that's it. Now I also want to increase font size to 1.45 rem. Then I want to give this a transition of 0.3 seconds because we're gonna have an hover effect on this later. Save that, and there we go. Now back here, we're gonna select again the submit button, but this time we're gonna add column hover. Then inside of that, we want to change background color to a darker color like this one. Save that, and now we have this nice hover effect. Great. After that, when we click on the input field, we want it to turn white, as you can see here. So to do this, we need first to create a class that we will name focus, in which we're gonna add a background color of white. So now every time we click on the input field, we need to add this class to that input and remove it when we click somewhere else outside the input. For that, we're gonna move to our JavaScript file, and up here we need first to bring in the input element. So we're gonna create here a constant that we will name footer input. Then in here we're gonna say document.querySelector.footer input. Actually, we should do here an underscore. Now underneath that, I'm gonna take the input element. Then I will give it an event listener of focus. So when we click on the input element, or we should say when the input gets focus, then we're gonna give it the class focus. Save that. And now when I'm gonna click on the input field, it will turn white. But this happens very fast. So we need to go back to our CSS and give the input element a transition of 0.3 seconds. This way we're gonna have a nice and smooth animation, as you can see. After that, we have to remove this white background when we click somewhere else outside the input. So back here, we're gonna copy the same code and paste it underneath, but this time we're gonna have here blur, which is the opposite of focus. And also we're gonna have here instead remove. So now when our input loses focus, the white background will be removed, as you can see here. Great. Now if we type something here, then we click somewhere else outside the input, we wanted to keep the white background. So going back here, before we remove the focus class, we have to check if the input is empty or not. So above that, we're gonna add an if statement, Then in here, we want to check if the input is not empty. So we're gonna say if footer input.value is not equal to an empty pair of quotes. So if the input is not empty, then we're gonna say return, which means this line below will not be executed. Hit save, and now when I'm gonna type something here, the input will keep the white background. Great. Now underneath the 4 columns, we're gonna have this part right here. So let's go back to our HTML, and below the grid for div, we're gonna create another div with class of bottom footer. Now inside this div, we're gonna have first the copyright text. So let's add a div with class of copyright. Then we're gonna have some social media icons and some other stuff. So let's add another div with class of follow wrap. Now inside the copyright div, we're gonna have a paragraph tag with class of text. Then in here, we're gonna say copyright, and we're gonna have here the copyright symbol. Then we're gonna say 2020 all rights reserved vertical bar made by TrueCoder. But here I want to put TrueCoder inside the span tag because I want to give it a purple color later. Save that, and there we go. Let's go now inside the second div, and here we're gonna have again 2 divs. So let's create the first div and we will give it a class of follow me. Then let's create the second div and we will give this one a class of back button wrap. Now inside the first div, we're gonna have an h3 title of follow me. Then underneath that, we're gonna have a div with class of social media. And here we will have a bunch of social media icons. So let's add first the Facebook icon. So we're gonna put it inside an anchor tag, and here we're gonna say i.fab.fa-facebook-f. Now let's copy that and paste it underneath, like so. Next, we're gonna have the Twitter icon. After that, we're gonna have the Instagram icon. And finally, we're gonna have the LinkedIn icon. Great. Let's move now to the second div. Let me come here. So inside of that div, we want to have this button that takes us back to the top of the website. Let me come here. For that, we're gonna create here an anchor tag with the class of back button. Then inside of that, we want to add an up arrow icon. So we're gonna say here i.fas.fa-chevron-up, just like that. Hit save. And there we go. Now let's style that. So we're gonna go back to our CSS, and underneath that, we're gonna first select the bottom footer class, which is the wrapper div. Then in here, we want to add a margin top of 5.5 rem and a padding of 1.7 rem. Save that, and now we have some spacing there. After that, I'm gonna set display to flex. This way the follow wrap div will be beside the copyright div. I'm also going to set align items to center to make sure the flex items will be aligned vertically in the center. And finally, I'm gonna set justify content to space between. This way the copyright div will stack to the left and the follow wrap div will stack to the right, as you can see here. Great. Now I'm gonna select the text we have inside the copyright div. Then in here, I want to change its color to 7B, 7B, 7B and its font size to 1.2 rem. Hit save, and there we go. After that, I want to change the TrueCoder color to purple. But before doing this, I'm just gonna add here this plane of align block and the text align of center, like so. Now below that, we're gonna select the span element, which is the TrueCoder part. Then in here, I'm gonna change color to the main color variable, and also I'm gonna give it a cursor of pointer. Hit save, and that's it. Now I'm gonna select the follow me wrap div, and here I want to set display to flex. This way the back button will be beside the follow div, as you can see here. After that, I'm gonna select the follow me div, which is the wrapper div of the title and the social media icons. Then in here, I'm gonna add the display of flex, which means now the social media icons will be beside the follow me title. After that, I'm gonna add an align items of center. This way the social media icons and the title will be centered vertically, as you can see here. Great. Now let's come underneath that and select the h3 title. Then inside of that, we want to change its color to 7B, 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 its font weight to 500, and finally, we want to give it a font size of 1.3 rem. Hit save, and there we go. After that, we want to create this line that you have here. So we're gonna go back to our HTML, and underneath the follow me title, we're gonna add a span element with class of footer line. Now let's move to our CSS, and here we need first to select the footer line that we just created. Then inside of that, we want to give it a width of 60 pixels and a height of 2 pixels. We also want to add a background color of 7B, 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 then a margin of 1.2 rem in left and right, and finally we want to make sure it's having a display of align block. Hit save, and that's it. After that, we want to style the social media icons. So back here, we're going to select each anchor tag inside the social media div, Then in here, we're going to change their color to 7B, 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 and we're going to increase the font size to 1.3 rem, like so. After that, we're going to give each one of them a margin right of 0.4 rem, and finally, we want to give them an hover effect. So we're going to add here first a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then below that, we're going to select again the social media icons, but this time we're going to add colon hover, and here we want to change their color to the main color variable. Save that, and now we have this nice hover effect. Let's keep going. So now we're going to move to this button to make it look like this. For that, I'm going to select here the back button wrap div, which is the wrapper div of the button. Then in here, I want to add a margin left of 2.5 rem. This way, we're going to have some spacing between the button and the social media icons, as you can see here. After that, I'm going to select the button itself, and here we need first to make sure that the arrow icon is centered. So I'm going to set display to flex. Then we're going to add a line item center and justify content center. After that, I want to give it a height of 55 pixels and a width of 55 pixels as well. And finally, let's add the background color of the main color variable, like so. Just underneath that, we're going to set border radius to 50% so we get the circle shape. Then we're going to change color to white. And finally, we're going to increase font size to something like 1.2 rem. Save that, and there we go. Let me come here. Now behind this button, we're going to have this animated shadow. So let's go back here to our code. But before adding that animated shadow, I just want you to give the button a box shadow of 0, 0, 20 pixels, 1 pixels with a color of RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0.15. So that will give us a transparent black shadow. Now you cannot notice any difference, but when we're gonna add the light shadow behind the button, you can then see this black shadow. I think we still need to add an hover effect on this. So let's add here a transition of 0.3 seconds. Then below that, we're gonna select again the back button, but this time with the hover selection. Open that. Then here, we're gonna change background color to this one right here. Hit save, and that's it. Now before I actually add the animated shadow, I'm gonna give the back button a position of relative, then a z-index of 2 to make sure it's gonna be always in front of the animated shadow. Great. Now let's go back to the wrapper div, and here we want to add a position of relative because we want to make sure that the shadow is going to be positioned relatively to this wrapper div. Now we're gonna come underneath that and select again the back button wrapper div, but this time we want to create a before pseudo element inside of that, which will be our shadow element. Open that, and here we're gonna first set content to an empty pair of codes. Then we're gonna set position to absolute so we can move our shadow however we want inside the wrap div. After that, we're gonna give it a width of 60 pixels and a height of 60 pixels as well. Let's add a background color of white, and finally let's add a z-index of 1. This way is gonna be behind the button since the button has a higher z-index. Save that, and there we go. Now we want to move this to the center. For that, we're gonna add here top 50%, left 50%, then we're gonna translate it back by 50%. Hit save, and now it's at the center. I'm also going to add here a border radius of 50%, so it will be circular, and finally I'm gonna decrease opacity to 0.08. This way it will be transparent, as you can see. Actually, we cannot see anything, but if I remove this border radius, then we can notice that the shadow is now transparent. Great. Now, as we saw shortly before, the shadow is going to be animated. But actually, before adding that animation, I just want here to decrease the shadow size by adding scale 0.7. Now, to make an animation in CSS, we should first add keyframes. Then we can give it a name like scale. Let's open that. So now in every animation, we have a starting point and an end point. So at 0%, which is the starting point, I want the shadow to start by having a scale of 1 and an opacity of 0.15. Then at 100%, which is the end point, I want the shadow to be bigger. So I'm going to increase this to 1.6, and I also want it to be not visible, so I'm going to add here as well opacity 0. Okay, now this is not going to work yet, and that's because we still need to bind this animation to the shadow element. For that, we're going to say animation, and here we need first to specify the animation name. So let's say scale, then I'm going to give it a duration of 1.2 seconds and a speed of ease out. I'm also going to add here infinite to make the animation continue forever. And finally, I want to give it a delay of 1 second before starting. Save that, and boom, there we go. Now if I click on this, it will automatically take me to the top of the website. And that's because it's having a number sign inside its href attribute. Now the question is, how can we smoothly scroll the page to the top of the website instead of just jumping there? The response is very simple. We just have to select here the HTML element, then add inside of that scroll behavior smooth. Save that. And now when I'm gonna click on this, it will smoothly scroll to the header section. Great. Now we also want to make these navigation links working. For example, when we click on the services link, we want it to take us to the services section and so on. For that, let's go back to our HTML file. So now, for each link here, we need to specify inside this href attribute the ID of the section that we want it to take us to. For example, we want this link to take us to the header section. So I'm gonna add here header, and later I'm gonna give the header section that ID of header. Let's keep going. So we're gonna have here services, and here portfolio, then here about. After that, we're gonna have here testimonials, and here contact, and finally we're gonna have here hire me. Now let's go ahead and add those IDs to their section. First, we have the header section, so let's add here an ID of header. Then we have the services section, so let's add an ID of services. Hit save, and now when I'm gonna click on the services link, it will smoothly scroll down to the services section. Let's keep going. So we're gonna have here an ID of portfolio, and here an ID of about. After that, we have the testimonials section, so let's add an ID of testimonials. Then we're gonna have here an ID of contact, and finally we're gonna add here an ID of hire me. Save that, and now when I'm gonna click on the portfolio link, it will take me to the portfolio section. Then if I click on the about link, it will take me to the about section. Same thing with the testimonials link, and with the contact link, and finally with the hire me link. Great. Now we also have some nav links in the footer. So let's go back to the footer links, and we're gonna do the same thing here. So we want this link to take us to the services section, this one to the portfolio section. After that, we want this link to take us to the about section. Then we want this one to take us to testimonial section, and finally we want this one to take us to the contact section. Hit save, and there we go. Everything is just working fine. So yeah, that's it for our portfolio website. Now we still need to make it responsive. So I'm gonna leave you with the speed coding, and then in the end I'm gonna go back to deploy the website into Hostinger.
searching for a longer day. People feeling like the light has just come. We must never stop the way. Birds jumping and I hear my name, grasping into a life. Life is happy but it's so insane. We must merely make a strive. Savannah, I'm coming home. Savannah, we'll never be alone. Savannah, the beauty of the world. Savannah, let's all take a walk. Savannah. Lion's gonna come. The birds have just begun. We will always take a stand for the people, for the land. Let's go back to when we were young. For the animals we stand. Let's go back to when trees were swung. Kids across the land. Savannah, I'm coming home. Savannah, we'll never be alone. Savannah, the beauty of the world. Savannah, let's all take a walk. Savannah, I'm coming home. Savannah, we'll never be alone. Savannah, the beauty of the world. Savannah, let's all take a walk. Savannah, I'm coming home. Savannah, we'll never be alone. Savannah. Lions roaring in the morning sun, searching for a longer day. People feeling like the light has just come. We must never stop the way. Birds jumping and I hear my name, grasping into a life. Life is happy but it's so insane. We must merely make a strive. Savannah, I'm coming home. Savannah, we'll never be alone. Savannah, the beauty of the world. Savannah, let's all take a walk. Savannah. Lion's gonna come. The birds have just begun. We will always take a stand for the people, for the land. Let's go back to when we were young. Savannah, I'm coming home, Savannah. We'll never be alone, Savannah. The beauty of the world, Savannah. Let's all take a walk, Savannah. I'm coming home, Savannah. We'll never be alone, Savannah. The beauty of the world, Savannah. Let's all take a walk. Savannah, I'm coming home, Savannah. We'll never be alone, Savannah.
And that's it. Our portfolio website is now fully done. So let's go back to Hostinger to deploy it and make it live on the internet. And we're here. So as you can see, I already claimed my free domain and I name it myportfolio00.com. But I still need to finish the registration. So let's click set up. And here I need first to specify my country. Then I need to choose whether it's a personal domain or a company domain. So let's go with personal and click next step. After that, I'm gonna add here some of my personal details. Then I can finish registration. And there we go, we have now our domain. Next, we need to set up the hosting. So let's click here. And that's gonna show us a hello message. I'm gonna hit start now. And here I am creating a website for myself. And it will be a portfolio website. Let's see what's next. So I don't know what to choose here. So I think I'm gonna go with this one. After that, we're gonna hit skip because we're not using WordPress or anything of that stuff. Then here we need to enter a domain. So let's choose the one that we just created. And finally, let's hit finish setup. That's gonna take a few minutes. And that's it. Our website is now ready. So let's go to control panel. And here, there are many ways to deploy our website. For example, we can just use the file manager, which is the easiest and fastest way. But in our case, we're going to use instead Git, which is going to give us more functionality. Now, if we're using Git, we need first to push our project to a GitHub repository. So I'm going to move here to GitHub. Then we can create a new repository by clicking the plus sign, then new repository. Now in here, we're going to name this portfolio. Then you can choose whether you want it to be a public repository or a private repository. So I'm going to go with public. And finally, let's click create repository. Great. Now we need to push our project into this repository. So we can simply do that manually by going to source control, then push it from here. But since I'm too lazy to do that, I'm gonna use comments instead. So let's open terminal by clicking view, then terminal. Let's also zoom this a little bit. And there we go. So here we're gonna first say git init to initialize an empty git folder. Then we're gonna say git add all to add all our files to the staging area. Once the files are added, we can go ahead and commit them to the git folder that we just created. So let's say git commit-m and we're gonna type a message of first commit. After that, we're gonna say git branch-m main to create a new branch called main. Then I'm just gonna copy this line and paste it here, press enter, and then the last step is saying git push-u origin main to push the git folder into our GitHub repository. Let's wait a little bit. And there we go. So now if I reload the page, we should see our files right there. Great, let's go back to our control panel. So we're gonna choose git, and here we need first to enter our repository link. So let's copy this and paste it right here. After that, we're gonna change the branch to main. Then we're gonna hit create. Once that's done, we can go ahead and deploy the repository by clicking here deploy, then clicking yes. And after a few seconds, our website should be deployed as you can see here. Now I'm gonna open a new tab and say myportfolio00.com, press enter. And look at that, our website is now live on the internet and everyone can see it. Nice. Now as you can see here, this is not secure yet. So if you still remember, Hostinger's premium plan comes with a free SSL certificate. So let's go here to activate it. And the process of installing an SSL using Hostinger is incredibly easy. Just pick your domain and click install SSL, like so. So now if I go back to the home page and refresh this, we can see that the SSL is now activated. Let's check this out. So we're gonna refresh this. There we go, the website is now secure. And yeah, I think that's it. So if you reach this point of the video, make sure to subscribe and like the video if you find it valuable. And also, feel free to leave a comment down below telling me how do you find this video and what you want to see next in this channel. With that being said, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next tutorial.